The glass of lukewarm water on the defense table did not vibrate when the heavy oak doors of the courtroom at Fort Belvoir swung open. But Chief Warrant Officer 3 Elena Vance felt the shift in air pressure against her eardrums like a physical blow. It was 0900 on a Tuesday in Northern Virginia, the kind of morning where the humidity already felt like a wet wool blanket draped over the Potomac. Inside the courtroom, the air was filtered, chilled, and smelled faintly of floor wax and the ozone of high-end recording equipment. Elena sat perfectly still, her spine a straight line that had been forged in the jump schools of Fort Moore and tempered in the high-altitude thinness of the Hindu Kush. She did not turn her head to see who had entered. She didn't have to. She could tell by the cadence of the footsteps, heavy, polished, slightly dragging on the right heel, that it was Colonel Marcus Halloway. He was the man who had signed the charge sheet, the man who had called her a liability to the United States Army, and the man who currently held her wings in his closed fist. Elena's hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her fingernails were trimmed short, the cuticles clean, though a faint, permanent ghost of hydraulic fluid lingered around the edges of her thumb joints, a mark that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly erase. To the JAG officers and the panel of senior bird colonels sitting in judgment, she was a 42-year-old woman from Olween, Iowa, with a clean service record that had suddenly, inexplicably hit a wall of insubordination. They saw a pilot who had spent too many hours in the cockpit, someone who had finally cracked under the pressure of a Tier 1 covert transport mission. They saw a woman who had disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer in a combat zone, an act that was the military equivalent of a mortal sin. What they didn't see was the way Elena Vance heard the world. She had grown up in the shadow of a John Deere dealership where her father had spent 40 years as a master mechanic. While other girls in Olween were playing with dolls or obsessed with the high school football team, Elena was sitting on a grease-stained stool in her father's garage, eyes closed, listening to the rhythm of internal combustion. By the time she was 12, she could tell her father which cylinder was misfiring in a 40-20 tractor just by the way the vibration felt through the soles of her sneakers. She didn't hear noise, she heard stories. She heard the friction of metal on metal, the microscopic whistle of a leaking gasket, the uneven heartbeat of a dying fuel pump. To Elena, a machine was never just a machine. It was a living, breathing system of frequencies, and she was the only one who knew how to translate them. She had joined the army because the recruiter in Waterloo had promised her the biggest engines in the world. She had excelled not because she was a natural pilot in the traditional sense, but because she flew the aircraft from the inside out. When she sat in the cockpit of an MH-60M Black Hawk, she wasn't just operating the cyclic and the collective. She was part of the airframe. She felt the torque of the T-700 engines in her own shoulders. She felt the pitch of the rotor blades in the back of her throat. She was the most decorated pilot in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment that nobody had ever heard of. They called her the Ghost at Fort Campbell, not because she was elusive, but because she could fly a 20,000-pound helicopter with such precise control that the sound of the rotors seemed to vanish into the background noise of the wind. But today, she was just the accused. The prosecutor, a major named Sterling with a haircut so sharp it looked like it could draw blood, stood up. He didn't look at Elena. He looked at the panel. He spoke about the sanctity of the chain of command and the absolute necessity of discipline in the face of the enemy. He used words like reckless, unauthorized, and catastrophic risk. Elena watched a small bead of condensation roll down the side of her water glass. She remembered the temperature of the air on the night of the mission, August 14th. It had been 104 degrees at the airfield in northern Nevada, a place the maps called the Nevada Test and Training Range, but the pilots just called the junkyard. It was a sprawling, desolate expanse of salt flats and jagged mountains where the most expensive secrets in the American arsenal went to be broken. The mission had been classified as Gray Horizon. It was supposed to be a routine extraction of a high-value technological asset from a crash site in the Deep Springs Valley. A routine mission in a place that didn't exist, flying a bird that had been modified with experimental stealth skinning that made it look like a blurred smudge on any radar screen. Chief Warrant Officer Vance, Sterling's voice cut through her memory, is a pilot of significant experience. No one disputes this, but experience is not a license for autonomy. In the United States Army, we do not vote on orders. We do not interpret them based on vibes or instinct. We execute them. Alina felt the controlled rage simmering at the base of her skull, a cold, hard knot. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She thought about the vibe she had felt at 0200 hours on that August morning. She had been standing on the tarmac of Hangar 4, watching Staff Sergeant Dutch Miller perform the pre-flight on her Black Hawk, tail number 72828. Dutch was a man from Biloxi who smelled of black coffee and grizzly wintergreen tobacco. He was the only person in the 160th who knew about Alina's gift, mostly because he'd seen her diagnose a hairline fracture in a tail rotor drive shaft just by touching the fuselage while the bird was at idle. "She's singing a bit high today, Chief," Dutch had said, wiping a rag over the matte black housing of the refueling probe. Alina had walked up to the bird. She didn't look at the gauges. She placed her bare palm against the skin of the transmission cowling. The aircraft was vibrating, a low-frequency thrum that most people would have dismissed as the standard resonance of a powerful machine. But to Alina, it felt like a discordant note in a symphony. It wasn't the transmission. It wasn't the engines. "It's the atmosphere, Dutch," she whispered. "The barometric pressure is dropping faster than the MEDOC report said. And the air, it's too thick with dust, high alkali dust from the flats. It's changing the cooling rate of the intake." "The Major says we launch in 10, Dutch replied, his voice low, shadowed by the brim of his cap. "He's in a mood, Alina. Something about the payload. They want it out before the sun hits the ridge." Major Holloway had been the mission commander. He wasn't a pilot. He was an operator who had transitioned into a command role, a man who viewed aircraft as buses that should do exactly what they were told without complaint. He was sitting in the back of the bird that night, surrounded by a team of 4 sooty suit technicians, civilian contractors from a defense firm that Alina wasn't allowed to name. They were there to recover a prototype drone that had gone down in the mountains. The dismissal had started before they even left the ground. Alina had climbed into the cockpit, her co-pilot, a young first lieutenant named Aris who was talented but green, already running the checklist. "Vance to command," Alina had said into the comms, her voice flat and professional. "I'm seeing a localized weather anomaly on the western ridge. The thermal gradients are spiking. I'm recommending a 30-minute hold to let the cell pass." There had been a long silence on the radio. Then Holloway's voice, sharp and edged with the arrogance of a man who had never felt the terrifying weight of a dead stick landing in the dark. "Negative, Ghost. The window is closing. The asset is heat-sensitive. We go now. That's a direct order. Follow the flight plan, Vance. Don't get creative." Alina had looked out through the NVG's night vision goggles. The world was a grainy, phosphoric green. She could see the dust devils dancing in the distance, tiny ghosts of heat and static. She knew. She knew the way a sailor knows the sea is about to turn. But she was a soldier. She was loyal to the mission. She engaged the rotors. As the Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac, the sound was perfect. To anyone else, it was the roar of 20,000 pounds of American engineering defying gravity. But Alina felt the slip. It was a microscopic hesitation in the torque conversion. It was the sound of the desert beginning to swallow the engines. Now, in the courtroom at Fort Belvoir, Major Sterling was pacing in front of the judges. The defendant claims she sensed a mechanical failure that did not exist on any sensor. She claims she diverted from the extraction point, leaving the ground team exposed, because of a sound. A sound, gentlemen, while the lives of 4 American citizens and the security of a multi-billion-dollar project were on the line. He stopped and turned, finally looking at Alina. His eyes were hard, dismissive. "The black box from that aircraft was recovered. We have the audio, we have the data, and today, for the first time, we are going to play it. We are going to hear exactly what the ghost heard, or more accurately, what she didn't." Alina's heart didn't speed up. If anything, it slowed. This was the moment. The cost of being right was usually silence. You were right, people lived, and you went home to a cold beer. But when you were right and people didn't want you to be, the cost was everything. She thought back to the moment the flight had turned. They were 20 miles out from the crash site, hugging the contours of the jagged Nevada hills. The Black Hawk was skimming the sagebrush at 140 knots. "Lieutenant," Alina had said to her co-pilot, "watch the EGT exhaust gas temperature on engine 2. It's going to climb." "Gauges are green, Chief," Aris said, his voice tight. He was nervous. Flying this low, this fast, in the dark, with a major breathing down your neck would make anyone nervous. Watch it anyway, Alina said. Then she heard it. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't a grind. It was a whistle, a high-pitched harmonic resonance that lasted for less than half a second. It sounded like a flute played by a ghost. Did you hear that? She asked. Hear what? Eris replied. The intake, the alkali dust is vitrifying. It's turning to glass inside the combustion chamber. The cooling jackets are clogging. Vance, shut up and fly, Holloway's voice barked over the internal comms. I'm looking at the same data. You are back here on the repeater. The engines are fine. Reach the LZ in 4 minutes or I'll have your seat before we land. Alina didn't respond. She felt the vibration change. It moved from the soles of her boots into her shins. The aircraft was fighting itself. The stealth skinning, designed to dissipate heat, was actually trapping the rising temperatures of the struggling engines. It was a design flaw, a catastrophic synergy of environment and engineering that no one had predicted. Except her. I am aborting the approach, Alina said. Her voice was so calm it sounded like she was ordering a coffee. I am turning south-southeast to find a landing zone with lower dust density. We are losing engine 2. You will stay on course, Holloway screamed. That is a direct order, Vance. If you turn this bird, I will charge you with cowardice and desertion under fire. The sensors are green. The sensors are green. The sensors are wrong, sir, Alina said. She turned the cyclic. The Black Hawk banked hard, the G-forces pulling at their chests. What are you doing? Eris yelled, his hands hovering over the controls, terrified to touch them, terrified not to. Saving your life, Alina said, and then Engine 2 died. But it didn't just die, it disintegrated. The vitrified dust had created a pressure spike that shattered the turbine blades. Shrapnel ripped through the housing, severing the primary hydraulic lines. The black box would record the scream of the metal, the sirens in the cockpit, and the chaotic shouting of the men in the back. But it wouldn't record the silence. Alina remembered the silence. In the split second after the explosion, while the bird was pitching violently to the right and the desert floor was rushing up to meet them at 100 miles an hour, Alina Vance felt a strange, terrifying peace. The discord was gone. The machine was broken, but it was no longer lying to her. She had used the remaining momentum, and the failing engine won to perform an auto-rotation that should have been impossible. She had guided the crippled, bleeding aircraft onto a flat stretch of salt crust with the grace of a falling leaf. When the skids hit the ground, the impact was heavy, enough to crack 2 of her ribs and shatter the nose wheel, but the cabin remained intact. They were alive, all of them. But as she sat there in the dark, the smell of burnt jet fuel and ozone filling the cockpit, she heard the final sound. The sound of Holloway unbuckling his harness and charging forward to the cockpit. Not to thank her, not to check on his men. You're done, Vance, he had hissed, his face inches from hers in the green glow of the emergency lights. I told you to stay on course. You cost us the asset. You cost the United States government 5 years of research. I don't care if the engine blew. You should have been at the LZ when it happened. We could have recovered the hardware. Now the site is hot and we're sitting in the middle of nowhere. The engine didn't just blow, sir, Alina had said, her voice trembling only from the adrenaline. It was murdered by the air. If I hadn't turned, we would have been over the ravine. We'd be a crater right now. There would be nothing left to recover, including us. That's for a court-martial to decide, Holloway said, and he had been a man of his word. Back in the courtroom, the lights dimmed. A technician in a crisp army uniform adjusted a laptop. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. It showed a waveform, a jagged blue line representing the audio captured by the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. We are going to play the final 5 minutes of flight 728, Major Sterling announced. I want the panel to pay close attention to the timeline. Note when the defendant claims to hear a failure and note the actual time of the engine flameout. Note the clear, repeated orders from the mission commander. And note the tone of Chief Warrant Officer Vance. It is not the tone of a soldier under duress. It is the tone of someone who has decided they are above the law. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. Alina closed her eyes. She didn't want to watch the waveform, she wanted to hear it. The recording started with the low, rhythmic thrum of the rotors. Asterisk Vance to command. I'm seeing a localized weather anomaly on the western ridge. Asterisk Alina listened to her own voice. It sounded small, distant. But behind the voice, she heard the Black Hawk. She heard the 728. The recording equipment in a Black Hawk is high quality, designed to survive a crash, but it filters out a lot of ambient noise to prioritize the voices of the crew. To the JAG officers, it sounded like a helicopter. To Alina, it sounded like a confession. As the recording played, she began to do something she hadn't done since she was a little girl in her father's garage. She tilted her head just a fraction of an inch. She narrowed her focus. She tuned out Sterling. She tuned out the courtroom. She leaned into the blue line on the screen. The recording reached the point where she had warned Aris about the EGT. Asterisk gauges are green, Chief. Asterisk asterisk watch it anyway. Asterisk there, a tiny, sharp spike in the audio. It was a sound no human ear should have been able to pick up over the roar of the rotors and the wind. It was a frequency, a 14.2 kilohertz whine that lasted for 1/100th of a second. Alina felt the hair on her arms stand up. In the courtroom, Colonel Holloway sat in the front row, his arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He thought the recording was his victory. He thought the silence of the censors was his proof. But Alina noticed something. She noticed the way the blue line on the screen didn't just show the voices, it showed the background. And in the background, underneath the scream of the dying engine, there was a secondary sound. A rhythmic, pulsing beat, asterisk thump thump, thump thump, asterisk it wasn't the helicopter, it wasn't the heartbeats of the pilots, it was an electronic signature. Alina's eyes snapped open. She stared at the screen. Her mind, the part of her that understood frequencies better than she understood people, began to race. She looked at the timestamp on the recording, 02:14:22. She remembered that moment. That was the moment she had felt the slip. The moment she had decided to turn, but the pulsing beat on the recording. It hadn't started when the engine failed. It had started 3 minutes earlier. It was a signal, a localized, high-intensity microwave burst. She looked at Holloway. He wasn't looking at the screen. He was looking at her. And for the first time, she didn't see arrogance in his eyes. She saw a flicker of something else, something cold, something guarded. The realization hit her with the force of a physical impact. The mission hadn't been a recovery. The Gray Horizon project wasn't a drone. The aircraft, her aircraft, the 72828, had been the experiment. They hadn't been flying to a crash site. They had been flying through a weapons test range. The alkali dust wasn't just dust. It was a particulate medium designed to enhance the effects of a directed energy weapon. Holloway hadn't been ignoring her warnings because he was arrogant. He had been ignoring them because he was waiting for the weapon to strike. He was the observer. She, Dutch, Aris, and the sooty suits were the lab rats. And she had ruined the data by surviving. She had turned the bird out of the primary kill zone of the frequency, which was why only one engine had disintegrated instead of both. She had saved the crew, but she had cost the asset being the recorded data of a human-crewed helicopter being brought down by a new form of electronic warfare. The trial wasn't about a direct order. The trial was a cleanup operation. They needed to discredit her. They needed to make sure that if she ever spoke about what she felt that night, if she ever described the whistle or the vibe, she would be dismissed as a broken pilot with a history of insubordination and auditory hallucinations. Alina looked back at the screen. The recording was nearing the moment of the crash. The sirens were screaming now. Asterisk, I am aborting the approach. I am turning south-southeast. Asterisk, asterisk, you will stay on course. That is a direct order, Vance. Asterisk, the courtroom was wrapped. The senior officers on the panel were leaning forward, their faces grim. To them, they were hearing a woman lose her mind and a commander trying to maintain order. Alina leaned over to her defense attorney, a young, earnest captain named Sarah Jenkins who clearly believed Alina was innocent but had no idea how to prove it. Sarah, Alina whispered, her voice barely audible. Look at the waveform, not the spikes. Look at the baseline between the voice tracks. Sarah frowned, squinting at the screen. I don't see anything, Alina. It just looks like static. It's not static, Alina said. It's a pattern. I need you to ask for a recess, now. On what grounds? Sarah whispered back. We're in the middle of the prosecution's smoking gun. Tell them the defense has identified a technical anomaly in the evidence that requires immediate expert review, Alina said. Her hand gripped Sarah's arm. Her grip was iron. If you don't stop this recording now, they're going to play the part where the signal changes. And if they play that, and I'm the only one who knows what it is, I won't just lose my wings. None of us are leaving this base. Sarah Jenkins looked into Alina's eyes. She saw the controlled rage. She saw the dark competence. But mostly she saw the fear not for herself, but for the truth. Sarah stood up. Mr. President, she said, her voice shaking slightly, addressing the head of the panel. The defense moves for an immediate recess. Major Sterling scoffed, spinning around. On what basis, Captain? We are in the middle of the most critical evidence in the case. The defense. Sarah glanced at Alina, then back at the panel. The defense has identified a potential tampering issue with the audio file. We require a forensic audio technician to verify the baseline frequencies before this recording can be admitted into the permanent record. The room erupted in a low murmur. Holloway stood up, his face reddening. This is a stall tactic. That recording has been under lock and key at the AAR after-action review facility since the recovery. The president of the panel, a silver-haired colonel with eyes like flint, looked from Sarah to Alina and then slowly to Holloway. He was an old-school aviator. He knew Alina's reputation. He knew that the ghost didn't stall. "Colonel Holloway, sit down," the president said. He turned to the technician. "Stop the recording." The jagged blue line froze. The timestamp was 02:16:45, 20 seconds before the explosion. Alina felt the tension in the room thicken. It was no longer the tension of a trial. It was the tension of a standoff. She could feel Holloway's gaze on her, a physical weight. He knew she had heard it. He knew she was the only person in that room, maybe the only person in the army, who could hear the ghost in the machine. "We will recess for 2 hours," the president announced, rapping his gavel. "Captain Jenkins, you better have more than a potential issue when we return. This panel's patience is not infinite." As the room began to clear, Alina remained seated. She watched Holloway walk toward the exit. He stopped near the doors and looked back. He didn't say a word. He just tapped his temple with one finger and pointed at the floor. Asterisk, "I see you," asterisk, the gesture said. Asterisk, "and you're already buried." Asterisk, Alina waited until the room was almost empty. Sarah was frantically packing her bag, her hands trembling. "Alina, what are you talking about? Tampering? I don't know anything about audio forensics. If I can't back that up, the colonel will have my head along with yours." Alina stood up. She felt the 2 cracked ribs protest, a sharp, familiar bite of pain. She ignored it. She walked over to the laptop where the technician was still disconnecting the cables. "Leave it," she said to the technician. Her voice wasn't a request, it was a command. The technician, a specialist who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else, hesitated. "Ma'am, I have orders to." "I'm a Chief Warrant Officer 3, Alina said, stepping into his personal space. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "And right now, that laptop is a piece of evidence in a contested trial. If you move it, you're interfering with a judicial proceeding. Step away." The specialist stepped away. Alina looked at the screen. She didn't touch the keyboard. She just looked at the frozen blue line. "Sarah," she said, "I need a phone, a secure line, and I need you to find Dutch Miller. He's being held in the witness quarters at the BOQ. They've probably got a guard on him, but he's a staff sergeant. He knows how to disappear for 10 minutes. "Alina, what is going on?" Sarah asked, her voice hushed. "They didn't disobey me, Sarah," Alina said, her eyes never leaving the waveform. "I didn't disobey them. We were never on a mission. We were the mission. And that black box recording, it isn't a record of a crash. It's a blueprint for a murder." She reached out and touched the screen, her finger tracing the tiny, rhythmic pulses in the baseline. "They think they played the recording for the court," Alina whispered. "But they actually played it for me. They wanted to see if I'd recognize the frequency. They wanted to know if I was as good as the rumors said." She turned to Sarah. Her face was a mask of professional calm, but her eyes were burning with a cold Iowa fire. "I'm better," she said. The environment of Fort Belvoir was supposed to be a place of safety, of law, of the old guard. But as Alina stood in the empty courtroom, she realized the threat wasn't in Nevada anymore. It was here. It was in the walls. It was in the chain of command that had decided one pilot was a small price to pay for a new weapon. She thought about her father's garage. She thought about the way a tractor would sound right before the engine threw a rod. There was always a warning, a change in the air, a shift in the light. The warning was over. The engine was already failing. "Go," Alina said to Sarah. "Find Dutch. Tell him. Tell him the ghost needs the 14. 2 filter. He'll know what it means." Sarah nodded, caught in the wake of Alina's certainty, and ran from the room. Alina Vance sat back down at the defense table. She was alone in the courtroom now, except for the specialist who was standing by the door, watching her with a mix of awe and terror. She picked up her glass of water. It was warm now. Flat. She looked at the clock on the wall. 10:15. She had 1 hour and 45 minutes to figure out how to play the rest of that recording without getting herself killed. Because she knew what was coming at the end of the tape. It wasn't the sound of the crash. It was the sound of what had happened asterisk after asterisk the crash. The part they had edited out of the official report, but that the black box, the unblinking, unfeeling witness, would have captured in the silence of the desert. The sound of the recovery team arriving, and the sound of the orders they were given when they found the crew still breathing. Alina closed her eyes and listened to the silence of the courtroom. To most people, silence was the absence of sound. To Alina, silence was just a different kind of frequency. And this silence, it was screaming. It was the sound of a conspiracy that reached higher than a lieutenant colonel or a major. It was the sound of a prestige program that had gone off the rails, and a woman who had been chosen as the scapegoat because she was just a pilot. They had put her on trial for disobeying a direct order. They were going to play the black box recording in court. But Alina Vance was about to change the channel. She felt the weight of her career, her life, her very identity hanging by a single vibrating thread. It cost her everything to sit there. It cost her the air in her lungs and the blood in her veins. But she didn't flinch. She was a night stalker. She was a ghost. And ghosts don't stay buried. The door to the courtroom creaked. It was a small sound, a dry hinge that needed a drop of oil. 5 milliliters of 3-in-1. Alina thought automatically. She didn't look up. "I know you're there, Colonel," she said. The footsteps stopped. Not Holloway. This cadence was lighter, more precise. "I'm not the Colonel," a voice said. Alina opened her eyes. Standing by the jury box was a man she hadn't seen in 3 years. General Arthur Vance, her uncle. The man who had given her her first set of wings and then disappeared into the black world of the Pentagon's deepest basements. He looked old. He looked tired. But his eyes were the same as hers, the eyes of someone who heard the things no one else wanted to listen to. "Alina," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "You need to stop, right now. Take the plea, accept the discharge, walk away." Alina looked at the man who had been her hero. She looked at the 4 stars on his shoulders, shimmering in the fluorescent light. "You knew," she said. It wasn't a question. "I knew the risks," he replied. "I knew the importance of the project, what you heard out there. It's not for this room, it's not for the world. Some sounds are meant to be kept in the dark." "They tried to kill us, Arthur," Alina said. She didn't call him general. She didn't call him uncle. She called him by his name, stripping away the rank, the history, the loyalty. "They used my bird as a target. They used Dutch and Aris as sensors." "It's bigger than you," he said, stepping closer. "It's bigger than all of us. If you play the end of that tape, you aren't just taking down Holloway. You're taking down the only defense this country has against the next generation of warfare. Is your pride worth that? Is your truth worth a national security catastrophe?" Alina stood up. She was 4 inches shorter than him, but in that moment she felt like she was looking down at him from 30,000 feet. "It's not pride," she said. She walked over to the laptop. She looked at the specialist who had retreated into the shadows of the hallway. She looked at her uncle. "It's the mission," she said. "And my mission is to bring the crew home, all of them, including the ones you're trying to bury." She reached out and pressed a key on the laptop. The waveform jumped. "I'm not taking the plea," Alina said. The general looked at her for a long time. There was no anger in his face, only a profound, heartbreaking sadness. "Then God help you, Alina," he said, "because the army won't." He turned and walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing like a funeral march. Alina Vance stood alone in the center of the room. The air was cold. The silence was absolute. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a tuning fork, 440 hertz. Perfect A. She tapped it against the edge of the defense table and held it to her ear. The sound was pure. It was true. It was the only thing in the world that didn't lie. She closed her eyes and let the frequency wash over her, centering her, grounding her. She had 90 minutes. Outside, the American sun was beating down on the asphalt of Fort Belvoir. Inside, the ghost was preparing for war. She wasn't just a pilot on trial. She was the witness they couldn't silence. And when that recording finished playing, everyone in that room was going to learn exactly what happens when you try to break the woman who can hear the world. She began to type. Her fingers moved with the same precision they used on the cyclic. She wasn't just looking at the audio anymore. She was digging into the metadata, the hidden layers of code that the sooty suits had buried in the flight recorder's operating system. She found the open loop. A back door, a way to broadcast the audio not just to the courtroom speakers, but to the entire base network. If they wanted a show, she would give them one. She would play the recording, but she wouldn't play the one they expected. She would play the one that the 7 to 8 to 8 had recorded in its own nervous system. The raw, unfiltered reality of what happens when the people sworn to protect you become the ones holding the trigger. The clock on the wall ticked, 10:45. Alina Vance felt the controlled rage settle into a deep, functional calm. The trial was about to resume, and the world was finally going to hear the truth, one frequency at a time. The specialist did not move. He was a kid, maybe 22, with a nameplate that read *Rivera*. and a pair of spectacles that kept sliding down a nose slick with the nervous sweat of a man caught between a career-ending order and a legend. He stood by the door of the courtroom, his boots clicking softly on the polished linoleum, watching Alina's fingers move across the keyboard of the government-issue Panasonic Toughbook. He knew he should call the shore patrol. He knew he should alert Major Sterling that the defendant was currently bypassing the encrypted partitions of the primary evidence drive. But every time he took a step toward the door, he looked at the set of Alina's shoulders, the absolute, unwavering stillness of a woman who had seen the earth from the cockpit of a burning helicopter and didn't blink, and his courage failed him. Alina didn't need to look at the screen to know Rivera was watching. She could hear the hitch in his breathing, the way his heart rate was spiking to a rhythmic 110 beats per minute. She focused on the code. The flight data recorder of an MH-60M Black Hawk was a miracle of redundant architecture, designed to survive a 1,000-degree fire and the crushing depths of the ocean. But it was built by humans, and humans always left a trail. Especially the sooty suits from the defense firm. They were brilliant at physics, but they were arrogant about the primitives who flew their machines. They thought a pilot only looked at the gauges. They didn't realize that for Alina, the gauges were just the lyrics. The metadata was the music. She found the first anomaly at 10:52. It was buried in the bus line protocols of the flight management system, a secondary data stream hidden behind a masking frequency that had been recording not the aircraft's performance, but the pilot's biometric response to the electronic environment. They weren't just testing the weapon on the airframe, Alina whispered, the words barely audible in the cavernous silence of the courtroom. "Ma'am?" Rivera asked, his voice cracking. They were testing the human sensor, specialist. Alina said, her eyes tracking a line of hexadecimal code that indicated a direct interface between the cockpit's avionics and the pilot's headset. They wanted to see at what point the microwave pulse would induce a cognitive break. They wanted to know if they could make a pilot fly into the ground without realizing they'd lost their mind. She felt a cold, sharp prickle of electricity at the base of her skull. It was a phantom sensation, a memory of the night in Nevada. She remembered the way the air had tasted like ozone and copper. She remembered the whistle. It hadn't been an engine noise. It had been her own neural pathways vibrating in sympathy with a high-intensity directed energy beam. The door to the courtroom opened, and Captain Sarah Jenkins hurried in. Her face was flushed, and a stray lock of blonde hair had escaped her tight bun. She was carrying a manila folder clutched to her chest like a shield. She stopped short when she saw Alina at the laptop and Rivera huddled in the corner. "Alina, I found him," Sarah said, her voice a frantic whisper. He was in the back of the BOQ. They had a sergeant from the MP detachment sitting outside his door, but I told them I was the JAG on record and I needed a private deposition. They gave me 5 minutes. "And?" Alina asked, not looking up. "He said to tell you the 14.2 filter isn't in the hardware. It's in the logs of the auxiliary power unit. He said they bypassed the main recorders to hide the draw. If the weapon was firing, the APU would show a 5% spike in thermal load that wouldn't appear on the engine diagnostics." Alina's fingers paused. A 5% spike. It was a tiny number, the kind of rounding error an analyst in Virginia would ignore. But to a mechanic like Dutch Miller, it was a smoking gun. "Did he give you the access key?" Alina asked. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, battered USB drive. It was charred on one side, a relic from some long-forgotten hangar fire. "He said you'd know what to do with it. He also said." Sarah hesitated, looking at Rivera. "He said Holloway isn't the one running the show. He saw a civilian on the tarmac before we launched. A man in a charcoal suit with a Navy SEAL tat on his inner wrist. Dutch thinks he's Blackwater or some derivative. He was the one who handed the sooty suits the hard drives before the flight." Alina took the USB drive. The metal felt cool against her skin. She plugged it into the Toughbook. "Rivera," Alina said, her voice sharp. The specialist jumped. "Yes, ma'am. I need you to go to the tech locker in the basement. Find a high-gain signal booster and a set of XLR cables. Don't ask permission. If anyone stops you, tell them Major Sterling ordered a live-stream diagnostic for the reconvene." "Ma'am, I can't." "Rivera," Alina said, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were 2 chips of frozen Atlantic water. "In 30 minutes, they are going to walk back in here and try to erase the last 20 years of my life. They are going to tell this panel that I am a broken woman who hallucinated a ghost. And if they succeed, they'll do it again. To the next pilot, to the next crew. Maybe even to you when they decide your life is a fair price for a data point. Do you want to be the man who helped them or the man who stopped them? Rivera looked at Alina. He looked at Sarah, who was nodding slowly, her eyes wide with the realization of the cliff they were all standing on. The specialist swallowed hard, reached out, and straightened his glasses. "Basement," he muttered. "Signal booster, I'm on it." He turned and ran out of the courtroom, his footsteps disappearing down the hall. Alina turned back to the laptop. She had the key. She had the location of the data. Now she just needed the time. "Sarah, I need you to go back to the records office," Alina said, her voice dropping into the low, rhythmic tone she used when the rotors were dipping toward the trees. "Search for any procurement orders under the name Vanguard Systems. Not through the Army portal. Use the civilian contractor database. Look for environmental testing, alkali medium." "What am I looking for?" Sarah asked, her pen ready over a legal pad. "A date," Alina said. "The date the alkali dust was delivered to the Nevada range. If I'm right, it wasn't a natural weather anomaly. They seeded the clouds. They manufactured the storm to create the perfect conditions for the weapon test. They didn't just wait for a bad night, Sarah. They made one." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "This is treason, Alina, if we're wrong, if we can't prove this in the next hour." "We aren't wrong," Alina said. "I can feel the frequency in my teeth." Sarah turned and left, leaving Alina alone in the courtroom. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with the weight of the 7-8-8. Alina closed her eyes for a second, letting her mind drift back to the cockpit. She could smell the recycled air, the salt on her lip, the faint scent of Dutch's wintergreen tobacco drifting through the cabin. She remembered the moment Engine 2 had failed. She remembered the way the cyclic had fought her, a wild, bucking thing that wanted to die. She had held it. She had forced the aircraft to obey her, not because she was stronger than the machine, but because she understood it. She knew where the stress points were. She knew how much it could give before it shattered. She opened her eyes and began to navigate the APU logs. There it was. 02-14-18. A sudden, violent surge in the auxiliary power draw. It lasted exactly 3 seconds, the first shot, then another at 02-14-25, the second shot, and then at 02-16-10, a sustained, high-intensity discharge that stayed at the red line for 12 seconds. That was the whistle. That was the moment the vitrified dust had choked the intake and the microwave pulse had shattered the turbine blades. But it was what happened next that made Alina's blood turn to ice. The APU draw didn't stop after the crash. According to the log, the power surge spiked again at 02-22-40, 6 minutes after they hit the ground. Alina looked at the timestamp. She remembered that moment. She had been crawling out of the wreckage, her ribs screaming, trying to help Eris out of his harness. Dutch had been on the perimeter with his M4, watching the dark. Asterisk, Chief, we got movement. Asterisk, Dutch had said. Asterisk, lights on the ridge, 2 vehicles, no markers. Asterisk, Alina had thought it was the SAR search and rescue team. She had been relieved. But the log showed that at 02-22-40, a high-frequency signal had been broadcast from the crash site. Not a distress signal, a data burst. The sooty suits in the back of the bird hadn't been checking on the pilots. They had been uploading the final telemetry of the failure to a satellite. And then the audio. Alina navigated to the end of the recording file, the part Sterling had intended to cut off. She put on her headset and hit play. The sound was a chaotic mess of wind and the ticking of cooling metal. Asterisk, Vance. Vance, can you hear me? Asterisk, that was Holloway. His voice was breathless, but not with fear. It was the sound of a man who had just won a bet. Asterisk, I'm here, sir. Asterisk, Alina's voice replied, sounding hollow and distant. Asterisk, Eris is pinned. I need a medevac. Asterisk, forget the medevac. Asterisk, Holloway snapped. Asterisk, Miller, get the contractors to the perimeter. Secure the data crates, now. Asterisk, then a new sound, the crunch of boots on salt crust, the sound of a heavy door opening. Asterisk, Major Holloway. Asterisk, a voice she didn't recognize, low, calm. Professional, the man in the charcoal suit. Asterisk, we have the telemetry. Asterisk, Holloway said. Asterisk, the pilot diverted. She nearly missed the primary focal point, but we got enough. The engine disintegration was 98% within the predicted parameters. Asterisk, and the crew? Asterisk, the voice asked. There was a long silence on the tape. Alina held her breath. Asterisk, they are a liability. Asterisk, Holloway said. Asterisk, the pilot heard the frequency. She's already asking questions about the intake. If she talks to JAG, the whole program is compromised. Asterisk, understood. Asterisk, the voice said. Asterisk, will handle the recovery. You take the bird's black box and get to the extraction point. We'll report a secondary explosion due to fuel leak. No survivors. Alina felt a cold sweat break across her forehead. Wait. Holloway's voice came back, sounding suddenly hesitant. Miller's a good NCO. He's got 3 kids. The program is worth $10 billion, Major. The voice said, and Alina could almost hear the smile in the words. And you just got a promotion to colonel. Don't find a conscience now. It's bad for your health. The recording ended with a sharp electronic click. Alina sat back, the headset slipping to her neck. Her heart was hammering against her cracked ribs, a dull, thudding pain that echoed the rhythm of the rotors. They hadn't just been willing to let them die in the crash. They had sent a team to execute them. The only reason she was sitting in this courtroom today was because Dutch had seen them coming. He had seen the way the rescue team moved, too fast, too tactical, weapons at the low ready. He had dragged Alina and Eris into the shadow of a ravine, and they had stayed there, silent as stones, while the charcoal suit team had scoured the wreckage with suppressed weapons. When the actual Army SAR team had arrived 2 hours later, Holloway had been forced to play the part of the grieving commander who had just found his survivors. But he had the black box, and he had the power of the chain of command. He had turned the narrative before Alina could even get to a hospital bed. She looked at the clock. 11:15, she had 45 minutes. The door opened again. Rivera was back, pushing a heavy rolling rack covered in cables and electronic components. He was panting, his face red. "I got it," he gasped. "The signal booster and the patch cables. I even found a wireless transmitter from the PA system. We can bypass the courtroom speakers and hit the base-wide emergency broadcast frequency." "Rivera," Alina said, standing up. "If we do this, there's no going back. You realize that? They'll come for you too." Rivera looked at the rack, then back at Alina. He reached out and adjusted his glasses one more time. "Ma'am, my grandfather was at Normandy. He told me the hardest part wasn't the jumping. It was the waiting to jump. I'm tired of waiting." Alina felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It was small, a tiny frequency buried under the static of betrayal, but it was there. "Set it up," she said. "Hide the transmitter behind the judge's bench. Route the audio through the toughbook. I'll handle the encryption." As Rivera began to work with the cables, his hands surprisingly steady, Alina walked over to the tall windows of the courtroom. She looked out at the rolling hills of Virginia. Somewhere out there, Holloway was preparing his final speech. Somewhere, her uncle was sitting in a dark office, trying to convince himself that the national interest was worth the soul of his niece. She thought about Olween, Iowa. She thought about her father's garage, the smell of grease and the sound of the old 40-20 tractor. Her father had always told her that you could fix anything if you were willing to listen long enough to find the break. The break wasn't in the engine. It wasn't in the code. The break was in the heart of the institution she had served for 20 years, and she was going to fix it. The weight of her gear, the phantom weight of her flight suit and her helmet felt heavy on her shoulders. She could feel the dark competence taking over, the part of her that didn't feel fear or rage, only the mission. She was no longer a defendant. She was an operator. "Ma'am, it's live," Rivera whispered. He had done it. A web of black cables ran from the laptop, under the carpet, and up into the vents behind the mahogany paneling of the judge's bench. "Testing," Alina whispered into the laptop's internal mic. In the distance across the base, she heard a faint, ghostly echo. The emergency speakers in the hallway, the ones used for weather alerts and giant voice announcements, hummed with a low-frequency carrier wave. She was in the system. The sound of the courtroom doors opening was like the crack of a rifle. Major Sterling walked in first, his face a mask of predatory confidence. He was followed by the panel of colonels, their medals clinking, their faces set in the grim geometry of military judgment. And finally, Holloway. He didn't look at Alina. He sat at the prosecution table, leaning over to whisper something to Sterling. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had already won. The president of the panel, the silver-haired colonel, took his seat and rapped the gavel. "This court is back in session," he announced. "Captain Jenkins, you requested a recess to investigate a technical anomaly. Do you have a report for this panel?" Sarah Jenkins stood up. She looked at Alina. Alina gave her a single, sharp nod. "Mr. President," Sarah said, her voice clear and resonant, "the defense has found more than an anomaly. We have found evidence of a catastrophic failure in the integrity of the prosecution's primary evidence. We would like to play the remainder of the black box recording, including the segments that were suppressed by the mission commander." Sterling was on his feet in a second. "Objection! The prosecution has already played the relevant portions of the flight record." Anything beyond the point of mechanical failure is irrelevant to the charges of insubordination. The defense disagrees, Sarah said, her voice rising. The events following the crash are directly relevant to the defendant's state of mind and the motivation behind the orders given by Colonel Holloway. The president of the panel looked at Holloway, then back at Sarah. He seemed to sense the shift in the room. The air was thick with it, a static charge that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "I'll allow it," the president said, "but keep it brief, Captain. This panel is not a theater." Alina sat down at the defense table. She reached out and touched the trackpad of the tough book. "Rivera," she whispered. The specialist, sitting in the back row, hit a key on a small handheld remote. "Mr. President," Alina said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I won't just play the audio, I'm going to show you the frequency." She hit **enter**. The large screen on the wall didn't just show the blue waveform this time, it showed a map. A map of the Nevada test range overlaid with the thermal signatures of the APU logs, and then the sound began, not through the small courtroom speakers, through the giant voice. The roar of the Black Hawk's engines filled the room, but it was amplified, deepened, vibrating the very floorboards. It was the sound of 20,000 pounds of steel and fire, but it was also the sound of the entire base listening. In the offices of the Pentagon, in the hangars of the 160th at Fort Campbell, on the flight lines of every airfield within 5 miles of Fort Belvoir, the sound of Flight 728 began to play. *Vance to command, I'm seeing a localized weather anomaly. Alina watched Holloway. He had gone perfectly still. His face went from red to pale to a sickly grayish white. He looked at the speakers in the ceiling, then at the screen, then at Alina. *Negative, Ghost. The window is closing. We go now. *The recording reached the point of the whistle. Alina had filtered it. She had boosted the 14.2 kilohertz frequency until it was a piercing, physical pain in the ears of everyone in the room. The members of the panel winced, some of them covering their ears. "What is that noise?" the president shouted over the din. "That," Alina said, her voice amplified by the system until she sounded like a goddess of thunder, "is the sound of a United States Army aircraft being targeted by a prototype directed energy weapon, a weapon being tested on American soldiers by a private contractor with the full knowledge of the mission commander." "Shut it off," Sterling screamed, lunging for the laptop. Rivera stepped into his path, his chest out, his glasses gleaming. "Don't touch the evidence, sir." The recording continued, the crash, the impact, the silence of the desert, and then the voices, *they are a liability. The pilot heard the frequency. No survivors. The courtroom was frozen. The silver-haired colonel on the panel was staring at Holloway with an expression of such pure, unadulterated fury that it seemed to radiate heat. Holloway was shaking. He looked like he wanted to run, but his legs had turned to water. Alina looked at the screen. She saw the open loop she had created, the data burst traveling through the base network, being recorded by a dozen different redundant servers. It was out, it was everywhere. It was a bell that couldn't be unrung. But then she heard it, a new sound. It wasn't on the recording, it was coming from the hallway. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots, not the polished heels of the JAG officers. These were the boots of a quick reaction force. The doors of the courtroom burst open. A squad of MPs in full tactical gear, led by a man in a charcoal suit, swarmed into the room. "Nobody move." The man in the suit shouted. He didn't have a name tag, he didn't have a rank. He had a suppressed submachine gun and a Navy SEAL tattoo on his inner wrist. The president of the panel stood up. "Who the hell are you? This is a military court. This is a matter of national security," the man said, his voice cold and flat. "This facility is now under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense Special Projects Office. You will all remain where you are. Specialist, step away from that rack." Rivera didn't move. He looked at Alina. Alina looked at the man in the charcoal suit. She felt the controlled rage tighten into a knot of pure, functional, lethal intent. She knew this man. She had heard his voice in the dark. "You're too late," Alina said. The man in the suit turned his weapon toward her. "Am I, Chief? You think a base-wide broadcast matters? By the time anyone outside this room processes what they heard, the servers will be wiped and you'll be a footnote in a tragic accident involving an unstable officer and a localized gas leak." He stepped closer, the muzzle of the gun inches from her chest. "You have a gift, Vance," he whispered. "You hear things, but you should have learned to listen to the silence." Alina didn't blink. She could feel the vibration of the floor. She could hear the hum of the HVAC, and she could hear something else. The sound of a very specific engine. A turbine, a T-700, but it wasn't coming from the airfield, it was coming from the roof. The windows of the courtroom rattled. The water in the glasses on the defense table didn't just vibrate, it began to dance. "What is that?" Sterling asked, his voice trembling. Alina smiled. It was a cold, hard expression that didn't reach her eyes. "That," she said, "is the sound of a friend." The ceiling of the courtroom didn't collapse, but the air pressure changed so violently that the doors were sucked shut. The sound was deafening now, the unmistakable, rhythmic thrum of a black hawk hovering less than 50 feet above the building. A night stalker. The giant voice crackled again, but this time it wasn't Alina's voice. It was Dutch Miller. Asterisk, Ghost, this is 7 to 8 to 9. We're on the roof. We've got the 160th Quick Reaction Force, and a very angry general with a search warrant signed by the Secretary of the Army. Tell the man in the suit to put the toy down before I decide to see how many rockets it takes to level a courtroom. Asterisk, the man in the charcoal suit froze. He looked up at the ceiling, his eyes darting around the room. He was a professional, and a professional knows when the odds have shifted from 100 to 1 to 0. He slowly lowered the submachine gun. "This isn't over, Vance," he said. "It is for you," Alina replied. She walked over to Holloway. He was slumped in his chair, a broken man. She didn't say a word to him. She didn't have to. The sound of his own betrayal was still echoing in the room, a frequency that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Alina looked at the president of the panel. The silver-haired colonel was standing now, his hand on his holster, his eyes fixed on the man in the charcoal suit. "Colonel," Alina said, her voice returning to its professional, controlled level, "I believe the defense rests." The president looked at her. He looked at the laptop, then at the ceiling, then at the squad of MPs who were now looking at their own officers for guidance. "Chief Warrant Officer Vance," he said, his voice formal, "this court is adjourned, permanently." The room erupted into chaos. MPs began to disarm the charcoal suit team. Sarah Jenkins was crying, a mix of relief and terror. Rivera was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands, laughing softly. Alina didn't join the celebration. She walked to the window and looked up. Through the glass, she could see the dark, matte black belly of the MH-60M hovering in the Virginia sky. The rotors were a blur of motion, a symphony of power and precision. She could feel the torque in her shoulders. She could feel the pitch in the back of her throat. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was a pilot. But as she watched the aircraft, she felt a sharp, sudden pain in her ear, a high-pitched whine that lasted for less than a second. She turned, her eyes scanning the crowd in the courtroom. She saw her uncle, General Arthur Vance, standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a small, black device in his hand. He caught her eye for a fleeting second, and in that moment the sadness she had seen earlier was replaced by something else. A warning. He tapped the device, turned, and vanished into the crowded hallway. The whistle in Alina's ear didn't stop. It changed. It became a pattern, a code. Asterisk 14-2, 14-2, 14-2. Asterisk, she realized then that the trial hadn't been the end. It had been the opening move. The weapon wasn't just a physical beam. It was a frequency that had been embedded in the very infrastructure of the military, and she was the only one who could hear it. She reached out and touched the window pane. The glass was cold, but it was vibrating, not from the helicopter on the roof, from something deeper, from the ground itself. The gray horizon wasn't a project. It was a protocol, and it had just been activated. Alina turned back to the room. Sarah was calling her name. Rivera was standing up, waving. The president of the panel was walking toward her, his hand extended, but Alina didn't see them. She only saw the blue line on the laptop screen, which had begun to scroll again. A new recording, a new timestamp. 11:45:00, the current time. The laptop was recording the courtroom, but it wasn't recording the voices. It was recording the background. And in the background, underneath the shouting and the sirens and the rotor wash, Alina heard the final sound of the day. The sound of a countdown. It wasn't electronic. It wasn't a clock. It was the sound of the base's power grid beginning to resonate at a frequency that shouldn't exist. A frequency that was designed to turn the very air into a weapon. Alina Vance felt the hair on her arms stand up. She felt the weight of her career, her life, her very identity being stripped away by a sound that only she could understand. She looked at Sarah, at Rivera, at the panel of colonels who thought they had just saved the day. "Get out," Alina whispered. "What?" Sarah asked, frowning. "Get out." Alina screamed, her voice breaking for the first time. "Everyone, get out of the building, now." She lunged for the laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. She didn't have 90 minutes anymore. She didn't even have 9. She had seconds. The giant voice crackled one last time, but it wasn't a voice. It was a scream, a high-intensity 2 kilohertz scream that shattered the windows of the courtroom and sent everyone to their knees. Alina stayed upright. She leaned into the sound, her mind a blur of frequencies and filters. She found the source. She found the break. She reached out and hit the final key. The sound stopped. The courtroom went silent, but it was the silence of a grave. Alina looked down at her hands. They were shaking, not from fear, from the vibration. She looked at the screen. Asterisk connection lost. Asterisk she looked at the door. Her uncle was gone. The man in the suit was gone. Holloway was gone. She was alone in the wreckage of the courtroom. And then she heard it, the most terrifying sound of all. The sound of her own heart beating in a world that had suddenly, inexplicably, gone completely mute. She had won the battle. But as she stood there in the deafening silence of Fort Belvoir, Alina Vance realized that she had just lost the war. The frequency wasn't coming from the base. It was coming from inside her. She had been the target all along. And the whistle wasn't a weapon. It was a key, and they had just turned it. Alina closed her eyes and waited for the dark, but the dark didn't come. Only the sound of a ghost finally finding its voice. The glass of the courtroom windows didn't just break. It atomized, turning into a glittering, lethal fog that hung in the air for a fraction of a second before the pressure wave from the roof slammed into the floorboards. Alina Vance didn't go to her knees like the colonels or the JAG officers. She didn't cover her ears against the 2 kilohertz scream that was currently liquefying the audio-visual hardware in the room. She stood in the center of the wreckage, her boots planted in the carpet, her eyes fixed on the empty space where her uncle had stood only seconds before. She could feel the vibration in her marrow, a rhythmic, pulsing thrum that felt less like sound and more like a fever. It was a sequence. It was a handshake protocol between the base's power grid and a localized transmitter that shouldn't have been there. She moved before the first MP regained his footing. She didn't look at Sarah Jenkins, who was curled in a ball near the defense table, or at Rivera, who was staring at his bleeding palms with the vacant expression of the shell-shocked. Alina crossed the room in 3 long, predatory strides. She ignored the side door, the one the charcoal suit team had used, and headed straight for the service stairwell behind the judge's bench. Her ribs screamed with every breath, the old fractures from the Nevada crash reminding her that she was made of bone and meat, but she pushed the pain into a small, dark box in the back of her mind and locked it. "Dutch," she whispered into the lapel mic she'd swiped from Rivera's tech rack. "Dutch, do you copy?" Static, a jagged, metallic tearing sound that made her teeth ache. "Dutch, if you can hear me, the signal isn't a broadcast. It's a resonance trigger. They're using the base's own transformers as a focal point. Get the bird off the roof. Now." She hit the stairwell door and began to climb. The air in the shaft was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and ozone. Every 5 steps, the emergency lights flickered in time with the pulse, casting long, strobing shadows against the cinderblock walls. This was the crossing. This was the moment where the legal victory became a tactical liability. By staying in the courtroom, she was a witness. By leaving, she was a target. By climbing toward the roof, she was an insurgent. She reached the top floor and kicked the door open. The heat hit her first, a dry, unnatural warmth that felt like standing too close to an open furnace. The HVAC system for the entire building was laboring, the fans spinning at a pitch that suggested they were seconds away from catastrophic failure. She ran down the narrow corridor toward the maintenance hatch, her hand reaching for the small of her back, searching for a weapon she didn't have. She found a heavy, steel-handled flashlight in a wall-mounted emergency kit and ripped it free. It wasn't an M4, but it had weight. It had utility. The hatch to the roof was heavy, reinforced steel. It was locked from the outside. Alina didn't waste time with the handle. She looked at the hinges. They were glowing, not with heat, but with a faint, violet ionization. The 2 frequency was concentrating here, at the highest point of the building, turning the metal into a makeshift antenna. She stepped back, wrapped her uniform jacket around her hand, and used the heavy flashlight to smash the manual release lever. The metal sparked, a bright, magnesium-white flash that left green spots in her vision, and the hatch groaned open. The roof of the JAG headquarters was a landscape of gravel and satellite dishes, dominated by the hulking, matte-black silhouette of the MH-60M Black Hawk. The rotors were spinning in a flat, idle pitch, the wash kicking up a storm of dust and grit that stung Alina's eyes. Dutch Miller was leaning out of the cabin, his visor down, a M240 machine gun swung out on its pintle mount. He was scanning the perimeter of the building, his posture rigid. He saw her and signaled for her to stay back, but Alina ignored him. She ran through the rotor wash, the air pressure trying to crush the breath out of her lungs. She reached the cabin and hauled herself up, her muscles burning. "Chief, you gotta get down," Dutch yelled over the roar of the T-700 engines. "We got multiple bogies approaching from the south, unmarked Hueys. They aren't responding to any hails." Alina grabbed a headset from the hook and slammed it over her ears. The noise died down to a muffled thrum, but the whistle was still there, a ghost in the wires. "They aren't Hueys, Dutch. They're Vanguard assets. They've been loitering in the blind spot of the Dulles radar." "What the hell happened down there?" Dutch asked, his voice tight with the specific brand of fear that only comes when the rules of engagement vanish. "The whole base just went dark. I lost comms with the QRF. I lost everything." "They triggered the resonance," Alina said, sliding into the pilot's seat. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for a co-pilot. She began the pre-flight checks with a speed that would have been impossible for any other pilot. Her hands moved in a blur, flipping switches and checking gauges she didn't need to see to understand. "The weapon isn't on the ground, Dutch. The base is the weapon. They're using the Belvoir grid to pulse a signal into the ionosphere. If they hit the peak frequency, they can knock out every satellite in the Western Hemisphere. They're going to blind the entire country, and then they're going to blame the crash on me." "So what do we do?" "We find the relay," Alina said. She pulled the collective, and the Black Hawk groaned, its nose dipping as it lifted off the roof. "There's a mobile uplink somewhere within 5 miles of this building. It's the only way they can modulate the pulse with that kind of precision. My uncle had the trigger. I saw it." "The general?" Dutch's voice was hollow. "Chief, he's family." "He's the mission, Dutch," Alina said, her voice flat and cold. "And the mission just changed." She banked the bird hard to the left, pulling a 3G turn that pressed her into the seat. Below them, Fort Belvoir looked like a dying organism. The lights were flickering out in sections, a creeping darkness that followed the path of the primary power lines. She could see the panic on the ground, headlights swerving, figures running across the parade grounds, the faint, flickering blue of emergency strobes. "ICM!" Dutch shouted. 4 o'clock, 2 birds, low and fast, their painted charcoal, no tail numbers. Alina glanced at the FLIR screen. The heat signatures were cold. They were using suppressed exhausts, a high-end modification meant for special operations. These weren't soldiers, they were contractors. They were the men who didn't exist, flying machines that weren't on any manifest. "They're painting us," Alina said. "Laser warning receiver is active. They're going to take us out before we can find the relay." She didn't wait for them to fire. She dived. The Black Hawk plummeted toward the tree line, the altimeter screaming. Most pilots would have pulled up at 100 feet. Alina waited until she could see the individual leaves on the oaks, until the shadow of the bird was a dark blur against the green. She pulled back on the cyclic at the last possible second, the airframe groaning under the stress. The bird leveled out, skimming the tops of the trees at 140 knots. This was the dark competence in its purest form. She wasn't thinking about the stick or the pedals. She was feeling the air. She could hear the way the wind moved over the rotor blades, the way the engines hummed in sympathy with the earth. She was navigating by the frequency. The whistle was getting louder to the west, toward the Accotink Creek. "Dutch, get ready," she said. "The signal is peaking near the old pump station. If I'm right, they've got a van or a Humvee parked in the clearing." "I got eyes," Dutch called out. Movement near the water. White van, high-gain antenna on the roof. "And we got company. The charcoal birds are coming about." The first missile streak was a line of white fire against the gray Virginia sky. Alina didn't flare. She didn't have flares. This was a transport bird, stripped of its defensive suites for the safety of the base. She had to use the environment. She jinked the bird behind a large warehouse, the missile slamming into the brickwork and showering the tail rotor with debris. The vibration in the stick intensified. The tail was damaged. "Chief, we're losing torque," Dutch yelled. "Hold on," Alina said. She pushed the nose down again, heading straight for the Accotink Bridge. It was a narrow, concrete span, barely wide enough for 2 trucks. She flew under it. The sound was a physical blow, the roar of the engines echoing off the concrete, the water of the creek spraying up into the cabin. The charcoal birds couldn't follow. They were too large, their pilots too sane. They pulled up, trying to overfly the bridge and catch her on the other side. Alina didn't come out the other side. She flared the bird hard under the bridge, the tail rotor inches from the water, and used the momentum to spin the aircraft 180 degrees. She was now hovering under the span, hidden by the concrete and the shadows. "Dutch the van," she said. "I can't see it from here, Chief. We're under the bridge." "Look at the water," Elena said. Dutch looked. The surface of the creek was vibrating in a perfect geometric pattern. It looked like a cymatic map, the water forming ridges and valleys that pointed toward a dense cluster of trees 300 yards upstream. "I see the resonance," Dutch whispered. "It's like a compass." "Go," Elena said. She eased the bird out from under the bridge, keeping it low, the belly of the craft scraping the tall grass. She saw the van now. It wasn't just a van, it was a mobile command center bristling with sensors. Two men in tactical gear were standing near the rear doors, their headsets glowing with the same violet ionization she'd seen on the roof. One of them looked up. He didn't have time to reach for his weapon. Elena didn't use the machine gun. She used the bird. She hovered 20 feet above the van and transitioned to a high-power hover, the downwash from the rotors becoming a localized hurricane. The trees around the van snapped like toothpicks. The men were blown backward, their gear scattering across the clearing. The van itself began to rock, the high-gain antenna snapping and falling into the creek. The whistle in Elena's ears reached a crescendo, a blinding, white-hot note of agony. She felt a warm trickle of blood run from her left ear. Her vision blurred, the world turning into a smudge of green and gray. "Chief, the charcoal birds are back. They're locking on." Elena didn't move. She couldn't. The frequency was pinning her to the seat, a physical weight that felt like a hand pressing on her brain. She could see the code again, the hexadecimal strings of the 14-2 protocol floating in the air before her. She realized then what it was. It wasn't a weapon. It was a mirror. The sooty suits hadn't been testing her reaction to the pulse. They had been mapping her neural pathways so they could use her as a relay. She wasn't fighting the signal, she was the antenna. "Elena, get us out of here." Dutch was screaming. She looked at her hands. They weren't her hands anymore. They were part of the machine. She could see the electrical impulses traveling from the stick, through her nerves and into the air. She saw her uncle standing on the ridge above the creek. He was holding the black device. He wasn't looking at the van, he was looking at her. He raised the device and pressed a button. The world exploded, not with fire but with light. A massive violet discharge erupted from the van, traveling up through the airframe of the Black Hawk. Elena felt her heart stop. She felt her lungs seize. She felt the dark competence shatter into a million jagged pieces of memory and pain. She saw Olween. She saw the tractor. She saw her father's face. "Asterisk, fix the brake, Elena. Asterisk," he said. She reached out, not with her hands but with her mind. She found the frequency. She found the 14-2 kilohertz note that was tearing her apart, and she didn't fight it. She tuned it. She shifted her internal resonance by a fraction of a degree, a feat of mental discipline that cost her every ounce of strength she had left. She turned herself from a receiver into a grounded wire. The violet light didn't stop, but it changed direction. Instead of traveling through her brain, it flowed through the airframe, down the landing gear, and into the wet earth of the creek bed. The van exploded. A real explosion this time. A massive, concussive blast of diesel and electronics that sent a fireball 100 feet into the air. The Black Hawk was thrown backward, the tail rotor finally giving way. The bird began to spin, a wild, nauseating carousel of steel and fire. "Hold on!" Elena gasped, her voice a shredded whisper. She fought the cyclic, using the last of the engine torque to guide the spin. She didn't try to stop it. She used the centrifugal force to flare the nose up, bleeding off the airspeed. They hit the ground hard, the landing gear snapping, the cabin slamming into the mud with a bone-jarring thud. Silence. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant crackle of the burning van. Elena sat in the wreckage, her head lolling against the seat. Her vision was dark at the edges, a tunnel of gray light. She could smell the fuel. She could smell the mud. She could smell the copper tang of her own blood. "Dutch," she croaked, a groan from the back. I'm here, Chief. I think my legs broke, but I'm here." Elena tried to move her arms. They felt like they belonged to someone else. She looked out the shattered windscreen. The charcoal birds were gone. The resonance was gone. The whistle was a faint, dying echo in the back of her skull. She saw a figure walking toward the wreckage. It was her uncle. General Arthur Vance looked old. In the flickering light of the fire, the lines on his face were deep, etched with a fatigue that no metal could cover. He walked slowly, his boots sinking into the mud. He stopped 10 feet from the nose of the bird. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't have the black device. He just had his hands at his sides, his shoulders slumped. Elena fumbled for the door release. It was jammed. She used her shoulder to shove it, the pain in her ribs a sharp, electric jolt. The door fell away and she tumbled out into the mud. She stayed on her hands and knees for a moment, the earth cold and wet against her skin. She forced herself up. She stood, swaying, her uniform torn and covered in filth. "Why?" she asked. The word was small, but it filled the clearing. The general looked at her. He didn't look away. "The world is changing, Alina. The wars we fought, they are over. The next war won't be fought with tanks or planes. It will be fought with the air itself, with the thoughts of the people who fly the machines." "You used me," she said. "I chose you," he corrected, his voice a rasp of dry leaves. "Because you were the only one who could survive it. I needed to know if the human sensor could be tuned. I needed to know if we could protect our own from the frequencies the Chinese and the Russians are building right now. You tried to kill me in Nevada. I tried to test you," he said. "The sooty suits, they were the only way to get the funding, to get the data. I knew Holloway would fail. I knew he would try to cover his tracks. I counted on it." Alina took a step toward him. Her controlled rage was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She saw him not as her uncle or a general, but as a component, a broken part in a machine that had outlived its purpose. "You failed," she said. "Did I?" He pointed to the sky. The stars were back. The darkness over Fort Belvoir was lifting as the secondary generators kicked in. The world was returning to its normal, chaotic state. "The data is gone," Alina said. "The van is gone. The relay is destroyed." "The data isn't in the van, Alina," the general said softly. "It's in you. Every second of that flight, every resonance you tuned, every frequency you grounded. It was recorded by the sensors in your flight suit, by the biometrics in your headset. You are the most valuable asset the United States military has ever produced." He reached out a hand. "Come with me. We can finish this. We can build a shield that will keep this country safe for 100 years. You won't be a pilot anymore. You'll be the architect of the new world." Alina looked at his hand. She thought about the whistle. She thought about the way Dutch had looked in the cabin, the way Rivera had looked in the courtroom. She thought about the cost. Everything she had done, every hour of flight time, every drop of sweat in the Iowa sun, every secret she had kept, it had all been leading to this moment. The moment where she had to decide what her loyalty was worth. She didn't take his hand. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, charred USB drive that Sarah had given her. The one with Dutch's logs. The one with the truth. "I'm not an architect," she said. "I'm a mechanic, and I found the break." She dropped the USB drive into the mud and ground it under her heel. The general's face went pale. "Alina, what are you doing? That's the only evidence." "No," she said. "The evidence is the silence." She turned and walked back to the wreckage of the Black Hawk. She didn't look back when she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching from the ridge. She didn't look back when she heard the shouts of the QRF team as they swarmed the clearing. She climbed back into the cabin and sat next to Dutch. He was leaning against the bulkhead, his face pale, his eyes closed. He opened them when she sat down. "Did we win, Chief?" he asked. Alina looked at her hands. They were steady now. The vibration was gone. "We're still here, Dutch," she said. "That's as close to winning as it gets." The next 3 hours were a blur of flashlights, shouting men, and the cold, professional efficiency of a medical evacuation team. Alina refused the stretcher. She walked to the medevac bird on her own power, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. They took her to a secure wing of the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. They didn't put her in a room. They put her in an observation suite. There were no windows. There were no clocks. There was only the hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor they had attached to her chest. She sat on the edge of the bed, wearing a thin, white hospital gown. She felt small. She felt fragile, but she also felt empty. For the first time in years, the world was quiet. The whistle was gone. The frequencies were silent. The door opened. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't an MP. It was Major Sterling. He looked different. The predatory confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. He wasn't wearing his dress blues. He was in a wrinkled suit, his tie loosened. He sat in the chair across from her. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just watched her. "They're calling it a localized atmospheric phenomenon," he said finally. "A freak lightning strike that hit the Belvoir substation and caused a chain reaction in the aging infrastructure." Alina didn't blink. "And the van?" "Gas leak," Sterling said. "A civilian contractor was transporting flammable materials, a tragic accident." "And the general?" Sterling hesitated. "General Vance has been granted an early retirement for health reasons. He's at a facility in Colorado. He won't be making any more public statements." Alina nodded. It was the institutional response, the reckoning she had expected. The truth was being buried under a mountain of paperwork and national security directives. "What about Holloway?" she asked. "Holloway is gone," Sterling said. "He took a walk into the woods behind his house 2 hours ago. They found his service weapon next to him. No note. The cost. It always came back to the cost." "And me?" Alina asked. Sterling looked at her, and for a second she saw a flicker of the man he had been before he'd sold his soul to the program. He looked afraid. "That's the problem, Vance," he said. "The sooty suits. They're gone. The data they collected is encrypted beyond anything the NSA can crack, but they know you were the focal point. They know you survived a pulse that should have turned your brain to jelly." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They want to know how you did it. They want to know what you can hear." Alina looked at the white wall of the room. She could feel the dark competence stirring again, the part of her that was already calculating the exits, the blind spots, the weaknesses in the hospital's security. "I don't hear anything," she said. "Don't lie to me," Sterling snapped. "I saw the map. I saw the way you flew that bird. You're a freak, Vance. You're a biological anomaly, and they aren't going to let you go back to Olween and fix tractors." "I'm a pilot," she said. "You were a pilot," Sterling corrected. "Now you're a specimen. There are people at the Pentagon who want to take you apart just to see how the gears turn." He stood up and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. "I'm supposed to tell you that your commendation for the Nevada flight has been approved, posthumously. As far as the public record is concerned, Chief Warrant Officer Alina Vance died in a tragic training accident at Fort Belvoir." He didn't look at her when he said it. "You have 1 hour before the transport arrives for the research facility. If I were you, I'd spend it thinking about how much you like the quiet." The door closed with a soft, final click. Alina sat in the silence. 1 hour. She looked at her hands. They were steady. She stood up and walked to the wall. She put her ear against the cold, painted plaster. She didn't hear the air conditioner. She didn't hear the heart monitor. She heard a pulse, a faint, rhythmic thrumming deep within the building's infrastructure. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a protocol. It was a heartbeat. She closed her eyes and focused. She began to filter the noise. She pushed past the 60 hertz hum of the lights. She pushed past the 400 hertz vibration of the medical equipment. She found it. A signal. A high-frequency, low-amplitude carrier wave that was being broadcast from a small, black box hidden inside the wall. It was a message. Asterisk 14-2, 14-2, 14-2, asterisk, but it wasn't the whistle. It was a name, asterisk Alina. Asterisk, she pulled her ear away from the wall. She looked at the door. She looked at the camera in the corner of the ceiling. She knew that voice. It wasn't her uncle. It wasn't the man in the charcoal suit. It was Dutch. He was in the building. He was in the system. He had survived the crash, and he had done exactly what she had taught him to do. He had listened. Alina felt a surge of hope. It was small, a tiny frequency buried under the static of her own betrayal, but it was there. She walked over to the heart monitor. She reached behind it and pulled a small, copper wire from the casing. She stripped the insulation with her teeth, the metal tasting of salt and copper. She looked at the camera. "I'm a pilot," she whispered. She took the wire and touched it to the terminal of the monitor. The room didn't explode, but the frequency changed. The giant voice of the hospital, the emergency alert system, crackled to life. It didn't play a siren, it didn't play a recording, it played a song. A low, rhythmic melody that sounded like the hum of a tractor in an Iowa field. Alina smiled. It was the sound of a friend. She didn't wait for the transport. She didn't wait for the doctors. She walked to the door and kicked it open. The hallway was empty. The lights were flickering in a perfect geometric pattern. Alina Vance began to run. She wasn't running from the military. She wasn't running from the program. She was running toward the horizon. The gray horizon wasn't a project. It was a destination, and she was already halfway there. The immediate aftermath was a ghost of itself. The base was a shell, the people inside it moving like clockwork toys whose springs had been wound too tight. Alina moved through the hospital corridors not as a patient, but as a shadow. She had 48 minutes left of the hour Sterling had given her, and she spent 20 of them in the maintenance tunnels beneath the surgical wing. The air down here was cold, smelling of wet concrete and the chemical bite of industrial cleaners. It was a sensory desert, but to Alina, it was a map. She could feel the pulse of the building, the vibration of the water pipes, the hum of the high-voltage lines that fed the MRI machines, the distant, rhythmic thud of the security team's boots on the floors above. She found the service elevator at the end of the north tunnel. It was locked with a biometric scanner, a high-end unit that required a palm print and a retinal scan. Alina didn't have either. She had the frequency. She took the small, handheld diagnostic tool she'd swiped from the medical tech's cart and pressed it against the scanner's casing. She didn't look at the screen. She closed her eyes and listened to the electronic hum of the processor. It was a 4 gigahertz signature, but there was a secondary harmonic, a tiny, high-pitched whine that indicated the lock's solenoid was under tension. She hummed. It was a low, resonant note that vibrated in the back of her throat, a perfect 440 hertz pitch. She felt the vibration travel through her jaw, through her arm, and into the diagnostic tool. The scanner chirped. The light turned from red to green. The elevator doors slid open with a hiss of compressed air. "Going up," she whispered. She didn't go to the roof. She went to the basement of the records office, the place where the paper trail of the 7 to 8 to 8 was supposedly being shredded. The room was a cavern of steel filing cabinets and industrial shredders, the air thick with the dust of destroyed secrets. 2 MPs were standing by the door, their M4s at the low ready. They weren't looking for a ghost. They were looking for a threat. Alina didn't give them a chance to find either. She used the darkness of the service corridor to her advantage, moving with the silent, fluid grace of a hunter. She reached the first MP before he could turn his head. She didn't use a weapon. She used the edge of her hand, a sharp, precise blow to the carotid artery that sent him to the floor in a silent heap. The second MP turned, his eyes widening, his finger tightening on the trigger. Alina didn't dive for cover. She stepped into his space, her hand grabbing the barrel of the rifle and twisting it upward. The shot went wide, the crack of the discharge echoing through the room. She slammed her forehead into his nose, a brutal, bone-crunching impact that sent a spray of red across her gown. He fell backward, gasping for air, and Alina caught the rifle before it hit the floor. She didn't kill him. She didn't need to. She just stood over him, the M4 in her hands, her eyes 2 chips of frozen Atlantic water. "Where is the black box?" she asked. The MP looked at her, his face a mask of blood and terror. It's in the vault, Section 4. They're waiting for the courier." "Who is they?" "The sooty suits," he wheezed. "They came back. They're taking everything." Alina turned and headed for the vault. It wasn't a standard military safe. It was a reinforced, climate-controlled chamber designed to hold high-security digital assets. The door was open. Inside, 3 men in charcoal suits were standing around a central table. They weren't looking at files. They were looking at a small, silver suitcase, the black box. One of them was the man with the Navy SEAL tattoo. He looked up as Alina entered, his hand moving for the sidearm at his hip. "Vance," he said, his voice a low growl. "I thought you were in a coma." "I woke up," Alina said. She didn't raise the M4. She didn't have to. She knew the acoustics of the vault. She knew that any shot fired in this room would ricochet off the reinforced steel walls, a lethal lottery that no one would win. "Give me the box," she said. The man in the suit smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. "You're a long way from the cockpit, Chief. You think a stolen rifle and a hospital gown make you a player? You're a data point, nothing more." "The data point has a trigger," Alina said. She reached into the pocket of her gown and pulled out a small, black device. It was the giant voice transmitter she had taken from the courtroom. "I've linked this to the building's fire suppression system," she lied. Her voice was steady, her pulse a rhythmic 60 beats per minute. "The moment I press this button, the Halon tanks will discharge. We'll all be dead in 30 seconds, but the black box will be preserved. And when the MPs find our bodies, they'll find the recording of Holloway's execution order." The men in the suits froze. They were professionals. They knew the lethality of a Halon discharge in a confined space. They also knew that Alina Vance wasn't a woman who bluffed. "You'd kill yourself for a recording?" the man asked. "I already died in Nevada," Alina said. "The rest of this is just overtime." The silence in the vault was absolute. Alina could hear the ticking of the man's watch. She could hear the hum of the server racks. She could hear the rapid, shallow breathing of the other 2 contractors. They were afraid, not of the Halon, they were afraid of her. "Put the box on the floor," she commanded. The man with the tattoo looked at his teammates, then back at Alina. He slowly lowered the silver suitcase to the concrete floor. "Now step back." They moved to the far wall, their hands raised. Alina walked forward, her eyes never leaving them. She reached down and grabbed the handle of the suitcase. It felt heavy. It felt real. She backed out of the vault, the suitcase in one hand, the M4 in the other. She didn't stop until she reached the service elevator. She hit the button for the roof. She had 12 minutes left. The roof of Walter Reed was a forest of antennas and HVAC units, bathed in the pale, sickly light of the moon. The air was cold, a biting wind whipping through Alina's thin gown. She saw the helicopter. It wasn't a Black Hawk. It was a small, sleek MH-6 little bird, the kind used by the 160th for covert insertions. It was idling on the helipad, its rotors a blur of motion. Dutch Miller was in the pilot's seat. He saw her and signaled for her to hurry. Alina ran across the roof, the gravel crunching under her bare feet. She reached the little bird and threw the silver suitcase into the back. "Chief, get in!" Dutch yelled. Alina paused. She looked back at the door to the roof. Major Sterling was standing there. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a folder. He walked toward her, the wind pulling at his suit jacket. He stopped 5 feet away. "You can't go, Vance," he said. "They'll hunt you. They'll find you. There's nowhere in this country you can hide from the program." "I'm not hiding," Alina said. Sterling looked at the little bird, then back at her. He reached out and handed her the folder. "What's this?" she asked. "The flight plan," Sterling said. "The one Holloway tried to erase. It shows the coordinates of the Vanguard testing facility in the Blue Ridge, and it shows the names of the civilians who were on the ground that night." Alina took the folder. "Why are you giving me this?" Sterling looked at the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. "Because I'm tired of the whistle, Alina," he said. "I can hear it too. Every time I look at a mirror, I hear it." He turned and walked back toward the door. "Good luck, Chief," he called over his shoulder. "Try to stay under the radar." Alina climbed into the little bird. She sat next to Dutch and pulled on a headset. "Where to, Chief?" Dutch asked. Alina looked at the coordinates in the folder. She looked at the silver suitcase. She looked at the blood on her hands. "Home, Dutch," she said. "Olween?" "No," Alina said, her voice dropping into the low, rhythmic tone of a pilot who had finally found her flight path. "The Blue Ridge, we have a brake to fix." The little bird lifted off the roof, its nose dipping as it accelerated into the morning mist. Alina Vance sat in the cabin, her eyes fixed on the mountains in the distance. She could feel the vibration of the rotors. She could feel the torque of the engines. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a specimen. She was a pilot, and the war was just beginning. The immediate aftermath of the flight was a silence that felt like a physical weight. As the little bird disappeared into the gray-green shadows of the Virginia wilderness, Alina Vance let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since the salt flats of Nevada. The air in the cabin smelled of hydraulic fluid and Dutch's wintergreen gum. It was the smell of the mission. She looked down at the silver suitcase. Inside it was the black box, the truth of Flight 7 to 8 and the proof that her uncle had turned his own niece into a biological antenna. She reached out and touched the metal casing. It was cold. "Chief," Dutch said over the comms. "We've got 5 minutes until we hit the dead zone. If you're going to make a call, do it now." Alina didn't hesitate. She picked up the encrypted satellite phone from the center console. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 10 years. It rang once. "Vance," a voice answered. It was a woman's voice, deep, weary, and sharp as a razor. "It's Alina," she said. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I heard you were dead," the woman said. "I was," Alina replied, "but I found the frequency. And I'm coming to the farm, Sarah. Tell the others. The gray horizon has been activated, and I have the key." "Understood," Sarah said. "We'll have the lights on for you." The call ended with a sharp, electronic click. Alina sat back in the seat. She looked out the window as the sun began to climb over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The world below was waking up, unaware of the war that was being fought in the air they breathed. She felt the dark competence settle over her, a cold, hard shield that protected her from the rage and the grief and the fear. She was alone in the wreckage of her life, but she wasn't broken. She was tuned. The little bird banked hard to the west, disappearing into the mist of the mountains. The reckoning was coming. The institutional, personal, and physical consequences of what she had done were waiting for her in the shadows of the Blue Ridge. But as she watched the sun rise over the Virginia forest, Alina Vance knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop until the whistle was gone, and the silence was her own. The coffee in the chipped ceramic mug was the color of Potomac mud and just as bitter, but Chief Warrant Officer Alina Vance held it with both hands because the heat was the only thing keeping her fingers from vibrating at a phantom 14. 2 kilohertz. It was 0400 hours in a safe house tucked into the limestone folds of the Blue Ridge, a place that didn't exist on any map provided to the Department of the Army. Outside, the Virginia fog was a thick, wet wool blanket that muffled the world, but inside Alina's skull, the silence was still screaming. She sat at a scarred pine table, her back to a fieldstone fireplace that had long ago gone cold, watching the way the steam rose from her cup in perfect, geometric spirals that shouldn't have been visible to the human eye. In the corner of the room, Sergeant First Class Dutch Miller was cleaning his sidearm, with the rhythmic, mechanical precision of a man who found comfort in the predictable geometry of springs and pins. He hadn't spoken since they'd crossed the state line. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the specific, earned quiet of two people who had just committed treason to save a truth that the rest of the world was currently working very hard to bury. Every few minutes, Dutch would glance up, his eyes lingering on the dark bruising around Alina's jaw and the way she sat too still, like a machine that had been pushed past its red line and was now cooling in the dark. 300 miles away, in a windowless briefing room deep within the E-ring of the Pentagon, the institutional machinery of the United States military was beginning its slow, grinding response to the Belvoir incident. Rear Admiral Harrison Vance, no relation to Alina, though the name was a bitter irony that wasn't lost on the JAG officers present, slammed a thick manila folder onto the mahogany table. The sound was like a gunshot in the sterile air. Around the table sat the cleaners, 3 colonels from CID, a frantic-looking legal counsel from the Department of Defense, and a man in a charcoal suit who didn't have a nameplate and hadn't touched his water. The official narrative is a localized atmospheric anomaly. The Admiral said, his voice a dry rasp that spoke of too many cigarettes and 40 years of navigating the bureaucracy of death. A freak lightning strike. It fried the Belvoir substation, triggered a cascading failure in the regional grid, and caused the accidental discharge of the fire suppression systems at Walter Reed. Any deviation from that narrative is a breach of national security. Am I clear? The legal counsel wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip. Admiral, the MPs at the records vault are still in the ICU. One of them has a crushed larynx. The other has a concussion that's going to keep him off flight status for a year. They're describing a woman in a hospital gown who moved like a Tier 1 operator. And then there's the little bird. We have a missing airframe from the 160th. You can't just call that a weather event. The little bird was a scheduled maintenance ferry that experienced a transponder failure, the Admiral countered, his eyes cold and flat. The pilot, Sergeant First Class Miller, is currently listed as MIA, presumed down in the Atlantic. We'll find the wreckage in a few months when the news cycle has moved on to the next crisis. And Vance, the man in the charcoal suit asked. He hadn't moved a muscle. Alina Vance is the primary asset. The General's research was contingent on her neural architecture. Without her, the gray horizon data is just a pile of encrypted noise. The Admiral turned his gaze toward the man. General Arthur Vance is currently being evaluated at a closed-circuit psychiatric facility in Colorado. He's been diagnosed with early-onset dementia and a delusional obsession with electronic warfare. His research has been classified as a symptom of his mental decline. The project is dead. The funding is being reallocated to the DARPA drone program. As for Alina Vance, she died in the crash at Belvoir. There will be a ceremony at Arlington, closed casket, full honors. The room went silent. It was a clean, professional erasure. The institution was protecting itself the way a body protects itself from a virus, by walling it off and pretending it never existed. They didn't care about the truth of the 14-2 frequency. They didn't care about the lives lost in Nevada, or the way a decorated pilot had been used as a human circuit breaker. They cared about the chain of command. They cared about the budget. They cared about the fact that a chief warrant officer had proven that the most expensive defense program in 40 years was actually just a sophisticated way to break human beings. The reckoning for the men who had built the program was happening in much smaller, quieter rooms. In a suburban home in Alexandria, Colonel Holloway's widow sat on her floral sofa, staring at the flag the casualty notification team had given her. She didn't know about the frequencies. She didn't know about the sooty suits or the black box. She only knew that her husband, a man who had spent 30 years serving his country with quiet, mid-level competence, had come home one night, looked at her with eyes that seemed to be seeing through the walls, and then walked into the garage with his service weapon. The institution had told her it was PTSD. They had given her a pension and a handshake, but she could still hear the way he'd been humming in the shower that last morning. A high, thin, rhythmic sound that had made the hair on her arms stand up. At the facility in Colorado, General Arthur Vance stood at a window overlooking a snow-covered valley. He wasn't wearing his stars anymore. He was wearing a gray tracksuit that made him look like any other aging man losing his grip on reality. 2 orderlies stood outside his door, watching him through a reinforced glass panel. They thought he was catatonic. They didn't see the way his fingers were tapping against the glass in a perfect 14-2-beat rhythm. He wasn't looking at the snow. He was looking at the way the sunlight hit the power lines in the distance. He knew what they were doing. He knew they were trying to bury him. But he also knew something they didn't. He knew Alina. He had watched her grow up in the fields of Iowa, watched the way she could hear a storm coming before the barometer even moved. He had seen her fly that black hawk through a resonance field that should have liquefied her brain. He smiled, a small, terrifyingly lucid expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You can't ground the lightning, boys," he whispered to the empty room. "You can only hope it doesn't hit you twice." Back in the safe house, the personal cost of that lightning was finally settling onto Alina Vance's shoulders. She tried to stand up to get more coffee, and her legs simply refused to acknowledge the command. She slumped back into the chair, her breath hitching in her chest. Dutch was at her side in a second. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew she wasn't. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his thumb pressing into the muscle the way a medic checks for a pulse. "The tremors are getting worse," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "It's just the adrenaline leaching out," Alina lied. Her voice sounded thin to her own ears, like a radio signal losing its carrier wave. "Don't," Dutch said. "I saw the readout on the little bird's telemetry before we shut it down. Your heart rate spiked to 220 when you were in that vault. You didn't just ground the signal, Alina. You absorbed part of the modulation. Your nervous system is trying to process a waveform that isn't supposed to exist in nature." Alina looked down at her hands. They weren't just shaking. The skin was pale, almost translucent, the veins standing out like blue wires. She could feel the whistle trying to return, a faint, metallic itch at the base of her skull. "I can still hear the house," she whispered. Dutch frowned. "What do you mean?" "The house, the wiring, the refrigerator in the kitchen, the hum of the battery in your watch. It's not just sound anymore, Dutch. It's texture. I can feel the friction of the electrons in the copper. It's like being in a room where everyone is shouting in a language I didn't know I could speak." She looked at him, and for the first time, the controlled rage flickered. Behind it was a raw, jagged fear, not of death, but of what she was becoming. She had spent her entire life mastering the machine, learning how to make the steel and the fuel and the physics do exactly what she wanted. Now she was the machine, and she didn't have the manual. "What did they do to me, Dutch?" Dutch didn't have an answer. He was a door kicker, a crew chief, a man who fixed things with wrenches and grit. He wasn't a physicist, but he was the only person in the world who had seen her clearly when everyone else was looking at a specimen. "They tried to turn you into a weapon," he said, pulling a chair over and sitting directly in front of her. He took her shaking hands in his grip firm and grounding. "But they forgot one thing. Weapons don't have a choice. You do, you're the one who walked out of that hospital. You're the one who saved the box. You're the one who's still sitting here." "I can't go back," she said, the realization finally landing with its full, crushing weight. "I'm dead on paper, my career, my rank, my name. It's all gone. I'm a ghost in a hospital gown." "Then we be ghosts," Dutch said. "The army gave me a lot of things, Alina. They gave me a trade, they gave me a purpose, and they gave me a set of values they apparently stopped following about 10 years ago. If being a ghost is what it takes to do the right thing, then I'm dead too." He stood up and walked to the window, peering through a slit in the heavy curtains. "Sarah's people will be here in 2 hours. They're bringing a civilian transport. We're going to the farm. It's a decommissioned signal site in the mountains. No grid, no wireless, just dirt and old-growth timber. It's the only place you'll be able to hear yourself think." Alina nodded, but her mind was already drifting back to the Pentagon. She could see the Admiral in her mind, see the way he dismissed her life with a stroke of a pen. The institution had protected itself, but in doing so, it had created a vacuum. They thought they had buried the gray horizon, but they had only moved it into the shadows. And she was the only one who knew how to navigate those shadows. The transition to the farm was a journey through the underbelly of a country Alina no longer recognized. They traveled in a rusted-out Ford F-150 that smelled of wet hay and diesel, driven by a man named Elias who spoke in the clipped, abbreviated sentences of a former intelligence officer who had seen too much of the why and not enough of the how. Alina sat in the middle of the bench seat, sandwiched between Dutch and the door, her head resting against the cold glass. Every time they passed under a high-voltage power line, her teeth would ache. Every time Elias's cell phone paged a tower, she would see a flash of violet light behind her eyelids. She was a human Geiger counter for a world that was increasingly saturated with invisible noise. They reached the site at dusk. The farm wasn't a farm at all. It was a cluster of gray, saltbox buildings huddled at the base of a granite cliff. It had been a Cold War listening post, abandoned in the 90s and bought by a charitable trust that was actually a collection of whistleblowers, disgraced spooks, and soldiers who had refused to look the other way. Sarah Jenkins was waiting for them on the porch of the main house. She didn't look like the terrified defense attorney from the courtroom anymore. She was wearing a heavy flannel shirt and work boots, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 72 hours preparing for a siege. "You're late," she said as Elias killed the engine. "We had to take the long way around a CID checkpoint near Front Royal," Elias said, climbing out of the truck. "They're tightening the net." Sarah's eyes went to Alina, who was climbing slowly out of the cab, her movements stiff and guarded. Sarah walked down the steps, her expression softening for a fraction of a second before the professional mask slid back into place. "The infirmary is ready for you," Sarah said. "We have a neurologist coming in from Hopkins tomorrow. He's one of us. He won't ask questions." "I don't need a neurologist," Alina said, her voice cracking. "I need the box." "The box is safe," Sarah said. "It's in the Faraday cage in the basement. But you need to sleep, Alina. You look like you're about to vibrate out of your skin." "I'm fine," Alina snapped, the controlled rage flaring up like a pilot light. She hated the weakness. She hated the way they were looking at her, like she was a glass ornament that might shatter if the wind blew too hard. "I'm the only one who can decrypt the secondary layer. My uncle used a biometric frequency lock. It's keyed to my neural signature. If you try to force it, the drive will wipe itself." Sarah exchanged a look with Dutch. He told her. Dutch whispered. "Of course he did," Sarah sighed. "He wanted to make sure she was the only key. He didn't just use her, he made her essential." They led Alina into the main house, a structure that felt solid and ancient. The walls were thick timber, the floors heavy stone. For the first time in days, the whistle subsided to a dull, manageable throb. The sheer mass of the mountain behind the house acted as a natural shield, blocking the signals from the valley below. Alina let out a long, shuddering breath. The silence here was real. It wasn't the empty silence of a vacuum. It was the quiet of the earth. She spent the next 4 hours in the basement, sitting in a small, copper-lined room that felt like the inside of a jewelry box. The silver suitcase sat on the table before her. She didn't open it. She just sat there, her hands hovering over the lid, feeling the faint, rhythmic pulse of the hardware inside. She could hear the code. It wasn't a sequence of ones and zeros. It was a melody. A dark, complex symphony of frequencies that told the story of Flight 72828. She could hear the moment the pulse hit the cockpit. She could hear the way the pilot's heart had sputtered and stopped, his nervous system overwhelmed by the same 14. 2 kilohertz note that was currently dancing in her own marrow. She saw the names of the sooty suits. She saw the manifests for the Vanguard assets. She saw the signatures of the men at the Pentagon who had authorized the test. It was all there. The gray horizon wasn't a weapon system. It was an execution protocol. They had been trying to find a way to kill from a distance without leaving a trace, using the very air as a delivery system. And they had used her to prove it could be done. A knock on the door broke her concentration. It was Dutch carrying a tray with a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. "Sarah says you need to eat," he said, setting the tray down. He looked at the suitcase. "Did you find it?" "I found everything," Alina said, her voice hollow. "It wasn't an accident, Dutch. Nevada wasn't a mistake. They wanted the bird to go down. They wanted to see if I could survive the crash while my brain was being flooded with the signal. They were testing the survivability of the relay." Dutch gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "They crashed a multi-million-dollar airframe just to see if you'd twitch." "They didn't care about the airframe," Alina said. "They cared about the data, and the data says that I'm the only successful prototype. Everyone else they tried this on. They are the ones in the health facilities, or the ones who took a walk into the woods." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with a cold, terrifying clarity. "Dutch, they aren't going to stop. The Admiral thinks he's buried it, but Vanguard is a private contractor. They don't answer to the Admiral. They answer to the people who sign the checks. And right now, the only thing those people want is the key that walked out of Walter Reed." Dutch didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Then we don't just stay in the shadows, Chief. We change the frequency." The next few days were a blur of physical agony and intellectual obsession. The neurologist arrived, a man named Dr. Aris, who had lost his license 5 years ago after trying to report on the psychological effects of non-lethal crowd control frequencies. He spent 6 hours hooked to Alina's head with a portable EEG, his face growing paler with every minute of data that scrolled across his screen. "It's not damage," he whispered, staring at a jagged peak on the monitor. "It's adaptation. Your brain has remapped itself, Alina. The synapses in your temporal lobe are firing in a synchronized pattern that matches the 14.2 modulation. You aren't just hearing the frequency, you're generating it." "Can you fix it?" Dutch asked. Aris looked at him, his eyes filled with a profound clinical sadness. "You don't fix an evolution. If I try to suppress the signal, I might stop her heart. Her autonomic nervous system has integrated the waveform. It's part of her heartbeat now." Alina sat on the exam table, her fingers tracing the scar on her ribs. She didn't feel like an evolution. She felt like a bridge that had been built over a chasm no one was supposed to cross. "What happens if I keep using it?" she asked. "If I keep digging into the box?" "The resonance will increase," Aris said. "It's like a feedback loop. The more you interact with the signal, the more your brain will adapt to accommodate it. Eventually, I don't know. No one has ever lived this long with this kind of neural load." "Then I'll be the first," Alina said. She went back to the basement. She worked until her eyes bled, until the skin of her hands was raw from the static of the copper walls. She began to map the Vanguard network using the black box as a compass. She found their shell companies. She found their offshore servers. She found the names of the men who sat on the board of directors, men who spent their weekends at charity galas and their weekdays deciding which soldiers were expendable in the pursuit of the next generation of warfare. But the personal cost was mounting. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the world as a grid of glowing lines. She couldn't eat. Everything tasted of ozone and metal. She was losing weight, her uniform hanging off her frame, her face becoming a gaunt mask of determination. Dutch watched her from the doorway, his heart breaking in a way that he couldn't put into words. He had seen men die in combat. He had seen them break under the pressure of the mission. But he had never seen anyone consume themselves from the inside out to stay loyal to a truth that didn't even want to be found. He didn't try to stop her. He knew better, he just stayed close. He brought her water, he sharpened her pencils, he cleaned the room. He was the anchor that kept her from drifting away into the frequencies. On the 7th day, the world outside the farm caught up with them. Alina was in the middle of decrypting a file labeled Project Harpsichord when the house's perimeter alarms went off. It wasn't a siren. It was a low, subsonic vibration that only she and the sensors could feel. She stood up, her legs nearly giving way. "Dutch!" He was already in the room, his M4 in his hands, his visor down. "I heard it. Movement in the North Woods, multiple heat signatures. They aren't local PD." "Vanguard," Alina said. "They found the leak in the server. Sarah and Elias are at the rally point," Dutch said, grabbing her by the arm and hauling her toward the stairs. "We have to go now." "The box," Alina gasped. "I got it," Dutch said, sliding the silver suitcase into a tactical pack. They ran through the house, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke and the sudden, sharp tang of ozone. Alina could feel them, the men in the woods. She could hear the hum of their tactical radios, the low-frequency pulse of their night vision optics. They were moving in a perfect pincer formation, closing the circle. They reached the back porch and the world exploded. It wasn't a grenade. It was a resonance burst. The air itself seemed to shatter, a wave of invisible pressure that slammed into the house, splintering the timber and shattering every window in the building. Alina went down, her head hitting the stone floor, the whistle in her ears reaching a deafening, white-hot scream. She could see the wave. It was a shimmering wall of violet energy rolling over the grass, stripping the leaves from the trees. "Chief, get up!" Dutch was screaming, but his voice sounded like it was underwater. He was firing his M4 into the woods, the muzzle flashes bright stabs of light in the dusk. Alina forced herself up. She looked at the violet wall. She could feel the 14.2 kilohertz modulation, the handshake protocol of the Vanguard weapon. It was searching for her. It was a bloodhound made of light. She looked at Dutch, who was being pushed back by the sheer pressure of the signal. His nose was bleeding. His eyes were bloodshot. He was dying, and he didn't even know why. The controlled rage finally broke. It didn't turn into panic. It turned into a quiet, absolute resolve. Alina Vance reached out, not with her hands, but with her mind. She found the frequency of the incoming burst. She found the rhythm of the weapon in the woods. She didn't try to ground it this time. She mirrored it. She stood on the porch, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the tree line. She opened her mouth and let out a sound, not a scream, but a high, pure note that vibrated through her teeth and her bones. It was the 14.2 kilohertz frequency, amplified by the resonance of her own brain. The violet wall hit her, and for a second she was the center of a sun. The light was blinding, the heat unbearable. She felt her heart stop. She felt her lungs seize, but she didn't fall. She projected the note back. The collision of the two frequencies created a localized EMP that rippled outward from the porch. The tactical radios in the woods hissed and died. The night vision goggles shorted out, blinding the men who wore them. The resonance weapon itself, a Humvee-mounted dish hidden in the oaks, overheated and exploded in a shower of magnesium-white sparks. The pressure vanished. The light faded. Silence returned to the mountain. Elena collapsed into Dutch's arms, her body limp, her skin cold to the touch. "Elena, Elena, talk to me." Dutch was sobbing, his voice raw. She opened her eyes. The world was dark at the edges, a tunnel of gray light. She could see the stars, but they were blurry, like diamonds underwater. I broke it," she whispered. "You did, Chief," Dutch said, hugging her to his chest. "You broke the whole damn thing." But as he looked out into the woods, he saw more lights, not the violet of the weapon, but the cold, blue strobes of the military police. The institution hadn't sent the sooty suits this time. They had sent the army. The admiral had decided that Mia wasn't enough. He wanted deceased. Elena felt the tremor in her hands again. It was different now. It was slower, more deliberate. She looked at the silver suitcase lying on the porch. The black box was still there. The truth was still alive. But she knew with a devastating, quiet certainty what the next hour would cost. It wouldn't just be her career or her safety. It would be the last piece of the woman who had grown up in Olween, Iowa, dreaming of the sky. The institution was grinding toward them, a relentless machine of iron and law, and she was the only thing standing in its way. "Dutch," she said, her voice steady despite the blood trickling from her ear. "Give me the phone." "Who are you calling?" Elena looked at the blue lights flickering through the trees. She saw the shape of the apps. She saw the silhouettes of the men in the charcoal suits who were moving behind the soldiers. "I'm calling the only person who can stop this," she said. She dialed the number for the National Military Command Center. The red phone. The one that didn't go to an admiral or a colonel. It went to the Oversight Committee. As the first soldier stepped onto the lawn of the farm, his rifle raised, his eyes fixed on the woman on the porch, Elena Vance felt the whistle one last time. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a weapon. It was a signal. "This is Chief Warrant Officer Elena Vance," she said into the phone, her voice echoing across the mountain. "I am in possession of the Gray Horizon data, and I am currently being engaged by unauthorized private contractors and U.S. military personnel on American soil." She paused, watching the soldier freeze as the words hit his comms. "I have a secondary relay active," she lied, her voice dropping into that dark, cinematic competence. "If my heart rate drops below 60, the entire encrypted drive will be broadcast on every open frequency in the Western Hemisphere, including the civilian cellular network." The soldier lowered his rifle. In the distance, the blue lights stopped moving. The institution had met its match, not in a weapon, but in a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. Elena sat back against the timber of the porch, her hand in Dutch's, her eyes on the rising moon. She was dying. She was a ghost. She was a traitor. But for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the stick. "Now," she said to the silence, "let's talk about the cost." The silence that followed Elena's ultimatum into the red phone was not empty. It was pressurized, the kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift. On the lawn of the safe house, the lead soldier, a staff sergeant whose name tape read Miller. No relation to Dutch. Just another piece of the American tapestry. Kept his weapon at a low ready. His eyes darting between Elena on the porch and the dark tree line where the Vanguard contractors were currently rebooting their fried electronics. He was a professional, a man who had likely spent his career following orders without questioning the physics behind them, but even he could feel the air vibrating. He could see the way the dust motes in the porch light were dancing in strange, non-random patterns, drawn toward Elena like iron filings to a magnet. "Hold your fire!" A voice crackled over the sergeant's radio, loud enough for Elena to hear. It was a voice she recognized, not the admiral, but someone higher, someone who dealt in the currency of international stability rather than just departmental budgets. "All units, stand down. We have a conflict of jurisdiction. Secure the perimeter. No one moves until the oversight team arrives." Elena didn't move. She couldn't have if she wanted to. The effort of mirroring the resonance burst had left her nervous system feeling like a burnt-out circuit board. Her vision was tunneled, the edges of the world fraying into static. Dutch's hand was a crushing weight on hers, the only thing keeping her from drifting off into the gray noise. He was whispering something, a rhythmic counting, a pilot's landing checklist, trying to keep her grounded in the physical world. "4 greens, Chief," Dutch muttered, his voice thick with a terror he was refusing to acknowledge. "Gear down, flaps set, you're on the glide slope, just stay on the needles." The wait lasted 42 minutes. In that time, the mountain air turned biting, the scent of ozone from the exploded dish mixing with the pine and the damp earth. 2 Black Hawks arrived first, their rotors beating a heavy, percussive rhythm that made Alina's teeth ache. They didn't land in the clearing. They hovered, their searchlights washing the house in a blinding, surgical white. Then came the SUVs, black, armored Suburbans that moved with a predatory grace across the uneven grass. When the doors opened, it wasn't a tactical team that stepped out. It was a group of 6 people in civilian suits, led by a woman with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from North Dakota granite. Senator Margaret Sutherland, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. She walked toward the porch with the gait of a woman who had spent 30 years ending careers before breakfast. Behind her, a team of medical technicians in sterile white fatigues moved with a frantic, quiet urgency. Sutherland stopped at the base of the steps, her eyes taking in the blood on Alina's face, the silver suitcase clutched in Dutch's other hand, and the shattered windows of the house. She didn't look at the soldiers. She didn't look at the burning wreckage in the woods. She looked at Alina. "Chief Warrant Officer Vance," Sutherland said, her voice carrying over the thump of the hovering helos. "I'm told you have something that belongs to the American people." Alina forced her dry throat to work. "It belongs to the families of the men on flight 728, Senator. I'm just the courier." Sutherland nodded once. It was a sharp, clinical gesture. "The courier looks like she's about to experience a catastrophic system failure. Step down, Chief. You have my word as a representative of the United States government. The data will be secured and you will be treated." "Her word isn't enough," Dutch growled, his grip on Alina tightening. Alina leaned into him, her weight heavy. "It's okay, Dutch. We opened the loop. They can't close it now without the whole world seeing the spark." The transition to the medical facility was a blur of cold air and the smell of sterile plastic. They didn't take her to a military hospital. They took her to a dark site in Maryland, a windowless concrete monolith surrounded by 3 layers of electrified fencing, and a battalion of MPs who didn't wear name tapes. For 3 days, Alina lived in a world of glass and sensors. Dr. Aris was there, allowed to remain as a consultant only because Alina refused to speak to anyone else. She was kept in a Faraday cage, a room lined with copper mesh that blocked every incoming and outgoing electromagnetic signal. It was the only place she could breathe. Outside the cage, the world was a cacophony of invisible noise. Inside, it was a tomb-like quiet that allowed her brain to stop fighting the 2 kilohertz ghost in her synapses. On the 4th morning, the door to the observation room opened, and Rear Admiral Harrison Vance walked in. He wasn't wearing his service khakis. He was in a dark suit, looking like a man who had lost a war but was still trying to negotiate the terms of the surrender. He stood on the other side of the glass, watching Alina as she sat on the edge of her cot, her hands finally still. "The general is dead," the admiral said. The intercom system made his voice sound tinny and distant. "A heart attack in his sleep at the facility in Colorado, or so the report says." Alina didn't flinch. She had felt it. 2 nights ago at exactly 0314 hours, a sudden, sharp spike of resonance had lanced through her mind, a final, frantic broadcast of a 14-2 signal that had then flatlined into nothing. She had known then that the last man who truly understood what she was had left the room. "Did you kill him?" she asked. "The institution doesn't kill its own, Alina. It just reclaims them," the admiral replied. He looked tired. The arrogance that had defined him in the Pentagon briefing room was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out exhaustion. "Vanguard has been liquidated. Their assets have been seized under the Defense Production Act. The Gray Horizon project is being moved to a deep black archive. It will never see the light of day. Neither will the black box you recovered. And the truth. The truth is a luxury we can't afford in a contested spectrum," the admiral said, leaning against the glass. "The families of 728 have been given an updated casualty report, an experimental engine failure. They've been compensated. Their silence has been bought with the kind of money that ensures their grandchildren will never have to work a day in their lives. It's the best we can do." Alina stood up, her legs shaky but holding. She walked to the glass, her face inches from his. You're wrong. The truth isn't a luxury. It's the only thing that justifies the uniform you're wearing. You turned me into a lightning rod so you could play God with the atmosphere, and when I didn't break, you tried to erase me. I'm not a specimen, Admiral. I'm a United States soldier, and I'm still standing. The Admiral looked away. You aren't a soldier anymore, Alina. You're a liability. You can't fly, you can't even be in a room with a standard-issue radio without causing a feedback loop. Your nervous system is a localized EMP hazard. You're being medically retired, effective immediately. Full disability. A house in a location of your choosing, provided it's out of range of major metropolitan hubs. You'll be monitored, of course, for your own safety. A gilded cage, Alina said. A cage nonetheless, the Admiral agreed. He looked back at her, and for a fleeting second, Alina saw a flicker of something that might have been regret, or perhaps just the recognition of a superior force. You won, Chief. You stopped the program. You broke the men who built it. But don't mistake that for a victory. In this world, the only thing that survives a direct hit like yours is the wreckage. He turned and walked out, the heavy steel door thudding shut behind him. The full human landing happened a week later, in a place the Army called a transition facility, but felt more like a high-end witness protection house in the shadow of the Tetons in Wyoming. The house was built into the side of a mountain, shielded by several hundred feet of granite, and a custom-built copper mesh lining that turned the entire structure into a sanctuary of silence. Dutch was there when she arrived. He had resigned his commission the day they left Maryland. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't ask for permission. He just handed his ID card to the gate guard and walked toward the civilian transport where Alina was waiting. He was carrying a single duffel bag and the same steady, unflinching loyalty that had carried them across the Nevada desert. They sat on the back porch of the house, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks. The air was crisp, smelling of sage and dry snow. For the first time in weeks, Alina wasn't wearing a hospital gown or a flight suit. She was wearing an old flannel shirt and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders. It's too quiet, Dutch said, breaking a silence that had lasted for hours. He was cleaning a set of binoculars, his movements slow and methodical. It's the only way I can hear myself think, Alina replied. She was holding a cup of tea, the ceramic warm against her palms. She could still feel the frequency, a faint, rhythmic pulse at the base of her skull. But here, away from the power lines and the cell towers, it was just a background hum, like the sound of a distant ocean. Aris says the adaptation might stabilize, Dutch said, not looking at her. He says you might be able to go back into town in a few months for short periods with the right shielding. Alina looked at her hands. The skin was no longer translucent, but the veins still traced a path of faint blue light when she was tired. She knew the truth that Aris was too kind to say. She was never going back, not to the sky. Not to the world of men and machines. She was a ghost who had found a home. I miss the smell of jet fuel, she whispered. It was the first time she had allowed herself to feel the grief of the loss. It hit her like a physical weight. The memory of the pre-flight walk-around, the vibration of the turbine through her boots, the moment the skids left the ground and the world became a map of her own making. That Alina Vance was dead. She had been sacrificed on the altar of the gray horizon. Dutch put down the binoculars and moved his chair closer to hers. He didn't say it was going to be okay. He didn't offer platitudes. He just took her hand and held it, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. We'll build a shop, he said. Elias is sending over some old woodworking tools, no electronics, just hand planes and chisels. We can make things that don't need a frequency to exist. Alina leaned her head on his shoulder. The loyalty between them was a tangible thing, a bridge built of shared trauma and earned trust. He was the only person who knew exactly what she had given up because he had been there to catch the pieces. Why did you stay, Dutch? She asked. You could have taken the payout. You could have stayed in the 160th. You were on track for Master Sergeant. Dutch looked out at the mountains, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. Because I saw you, he said simply. Everyone else saw a pilot or a specimen or a problem to be solved. I saw the woman who held onto the stick when the world was literally tearing itself apart to make her let go. You're the best soldier I ever knew, Alina, and I'm not about to let the best soldier I know walk into the dark alone. The tears came then, not the hot, jagged tears of rage, but a slow, quiet release. She cried for the men on 7 to 8 to 8. She cried for her uncle, who had loved her in the only broken way he knew how. She cried for the girl from Iowa who had just wanted to touch the clouds. Dutch held her through all of it, a solid, grounding presence in a world that had become increasingly ethereal. In the weeks that followed, the ghost life took on a rhythm of its own. They worked the wood. They hiked the trails where the granite was thickest. They learned to communicate in the silences between the pulses. Alina found that she could sense the mountain, the movement of the groundwater deep in the rock, the approach of a thunderstorm hours before the clouds appeared. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a part of the landscape's own internal resonance. The institution didn't forget them, but it grew distant. Once a month, a black SUV would drive to the end of the dirt road, and a man in a suit would leave a crate of supplies and a medical kit. They never spoke. The man would wait until Dutch collected the crate, then turn around and drive back to the world of noise. It was a cold, transactional peace. One afternoon, in the late autumn when the first real snow was beginning to dust the pines, Alina was in the workshop. She was carving a piece of cherry wood. The scent of the fruit was sweet and sharp in the cool air. The whistle in her head suddenly spiked, a clean, sharp note that wasn't the 14-2 frequency. She put down the chisel and walked outside. A bird was perched on the porch railing. A mountain bluebird, its feathers a shock of brilliant, impossible azure against the gray wood. It was looking at her, its head tilted, its small chest vibrating with a song she could feel more than she could hear. Alina stood still, holding her breath. She didn't reach out. She just opened her mind to the bird's frequency. It was a complex, beautiful melody, a chaotic and perfect broadcast of life. For a moment, her own internal rhythm synchronized with the bird's. The 14-2 kilohertz note didn't vanish, but it was harmonized, swallowed by the sheer, joyous noise of the creature in front of her. She understood then what she hadn't understood in the vault at Walter Reed. They had tried to turn her into a weapon by isolating a single, destructive frequency. They had thought that by breaking the world down into its component parts, they could control it. But the world wasn't a set of frequencies to be mastered. It was a symphony to be joined. She wasn't a broken machine. She was a different kind of instrument. Dutch came out of the house, stopping in the doorway. He saw the bird, saw the way Alina was standing, not with the rigid control of a soldier, but with the fluid, open grace of someone who was finally listening. He didn't say a word. He just watched. The bluebird stayed for a long minute. It sung a tiny, defiant pulse in the vast mountain silence. Then, with a flick of its wings, it took flight, a streak of blue disappearing into the dark green of the pines. Alina watched it go until she could no longer see the color. She felt the cold wind on her face, the weight of the mountain behind her, and the steady beat of her own heart. The cost had been everything. Her name, her career, her health, her future in the sky. All of it was gone, traded for a truth that would never be spoken in a courtroom or written in a history book. But as she looked at Dutch, and then at the vast, unshielded expanse of the Wyoming wilderness, she realized that she was finally free of the gray horizon. She wasn't waiting for a signal anymore. She was the signal. The report at the Pentagon would always say that Chief Warrant Officer Alina Vance died in a training accident in Virginia. There would be a small stone at Arlington, a place for people to leave flowers for a ghost. The institution would continue its grind, searching for the next weapon, the next advantage, the next way to silence the noise. But up here, where the granite met the sky, the noise was different. Alina walked back into the workshop, her fingers grazing the rough bark of the cherry wood. She picked up her chisel, the steel cold and familiar in her hand. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, a white, silent blanket that muffled the world and hid the tracks of the black subs. She didn't need a radio to know that the storm was coming. She could feel the pressure changing, the air tightening, the frequency of the earth shifting to accommodate the winter. She was ready for it. She had been trained by the best, broken by the worst, and rebuilt by the silence. Dutch appeared in the workshop doorway holding 2 mugs of coffee. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just set the mug down on the workbench and leaned against the frame, watching the snow. "You hear that?" he asked softly. Alina closed her eyes. She listened to the hum of the mountain, the vibration of the wind in the trees, and the faint, rhythmic whistle that was now as much a part of her as her own breath. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a secret. It was just the sound of existing in a world that was far bigger and more complicated than the men in the suits would ever understand. "I hear everything, Dutch," she said. She went back to work, the shavings of cherry wood falling like copper snow around her boots. The controlled rage was gone, replaced by a dark, quiet competence that didn't need admission to justify itself. She was a woman who had seen the edge of the world and decided to stay there, guarding the silence for as long as it lasted. She knew the Admiral was wrong about one thing. She hadn't just survived the wreckage. She had become the thing that the wreckage could never bury. The sun disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the valley in a deep, violet twilight. The house on the mountain was the only light for miles, a small, steady spark in the wilderness. Inside, the frequency was steady, the rhythm was true, and the cost was paid in full. Elena Vance stopped carving and looked out the window one last time before the dark took the world. She thought of the little bird, the black hawk, and the feel of the cyclic in her hand. She thought of the clouds and the way the light looked at 30,000 feet. Then she looked at her hands, scarred and steady, and she let the memory go. She was exactly where she needed to be. The 14. 2 kilohertz whistle hummed in the back of her skull, a constant, invisible companion that reminded her of who she was and what she had done. It was the sound of the truth, and she was the only one left to hear it. She picked up the chisel and began again, the metal biting into the wood with a clean, rhythmic sound that matched the beating of her heart. The sky turned to ink, and the mountain went quiet.